Yeah. It's like around quite funny. I feel like things are like, so did you come last year?
No, I
Next. Okay, I think everyone's sat. So good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all this morning. I'm Bobby from the Internet Watch Foundation.
And I'm Archie from Tech UK.
And we're both part of the UK IGF steering committee. So just by way of introduction, on behalf of the Internet Governance Forum Steering Committee and Nominet, we are delighted to join you today as part of the UK IGF 2024. So the UK IGF, for those unfamiliar, is the National Internet Governance Forum for the UK and was first established in 2009. So the UK IGF are an initiative led by the United Nations for the discussion of public policy issues relating to the internet. A key distinguishing feature is that they are based on the multi-stakeholder model, and therefore the steering committee is made up of a range of individuals from all sectors of society to create a well-rounded discussion. We hold the UK IGF today in anticipation of the global IGF, which is taking place in Riyadh, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in December. So this year's theme is building out multi-stakeholder digital future. So we're really looking forward to the discussion today. And as you can see, we've got a really exciting agenda and some excellent speakers. So we'll be kicking off today with some opening remarks from Paul Fletcher, the CEO of Nominet UK, and then we'll be joined by the Right Honourable Baroness Jones, the Under Secretary of State for the Future of Digital Economy and Online Safety at DCIT. So as you can see, we've got some breaks throughout the day, and lunch will be served just outside at 12:25.
Yes, and just before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. The Wi-Fi is the guest Wi-Fi for the Institute of Chartered Accountants. The password is on a sign outside at reception. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if you hear the fire alarm, then please just leave the building by the nearest fire exit, following the green exit signs to the assembly point. The assembly point for staff and visitors is at the Copthall Close Whalebone Court off Copthall Avenue. The toilets are located just outside the auditorium, and refreshments during the break will be served in the atrium, which is just out there. For the Q&A, there will be time at the end of each session for a Q&A. If in the room, if you have a question, please just raise your hand. And when asking your question, can you please remember to turn on your microphone and turn it off once you have asked. This is so people online can hear your question, and you can turn it off so that we don't get feedback coming in throughout the room. For those of us joining online, please submit your question from the Q&A function on the Zoom meeting, and this will be conveyed to the panel and the speaker. If you would like to present your question live, please just put this in brackets at the front of your question and ensure your microphone and camera is switched on. The moderator will introduce you, and then you can ask your question. With all that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to pass over to Paul Fletcher, CEO of Nominet UK.
Thanks, Archie and Bobby, and good morning, everybody. As they said, I'm Paul Fletcher, Nominet's Chief Executive, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to UK IGF. So today's event takes place under the global IGF theme, Building Our Multi-Stakeholder Digital Future, and marks the 19th UK IGF. Nominet's really proud to support this forum, and we provide the secretariat. And for those of you that haven't heard of us, we operate the .uk domain registry and strive to bring positive change to the UK digital economy and global internet community. We have a positive impact on society and focus on shaping a safer, more interconnected and inclusive world through several flagship public benefit programmes in areas including online safety and digital skills. We also work with the UK government and Ofcom to ensure that .uk domain, part of critical national infrastructure, is one of the safest and most secure in the world. So of the people joining us today, both in person and online, 79 are attending UK IGF for the first time, so welcome. And we welcome back 88 participants who have attended a UK IGF previously. We've got 46 participants under the age of 34, and it's crucial that the IGF and internet governance more generally provides an opportunity for newcomers, particularly the next generation, to participate and in time, hopefully take up leadership roles in this space. So we're especially pleased to have you with us today. So this year's UK IGF is taking place against a markedly different backdrop to last year's. The world now faces not one, but two major conflicts. The outcome of the US election taking place today will have a massive impact on Americans, but also on the wider world, including the future of multilateralism. And in the UK context, we have a new government with a new set of priorities and large-scale domestic challenges to address, from building an NHS fit for the future to driving economic growth. Digital and tech are key enablers of the UK government's ambition in a number of areas, whether that be the use of AI in healthcare or ensuring the workforce has the right digital skills to take advantage of the opportunities of advanced technologies. And today's IGF will enable us to discuss these important topics with leading voices from a range of disciplines, including digital inclusion, the governance and regulation of AI, and the impact of mis- and disinformation on democracy. This year and next are also important ones for the global digital policy agenda, particularly in the context of the United Nations. The UN Global Digital Compact, agreed in September in New York, marks a significant milestone in the collective global effort to build an inclusive, open, sustainable, fair, safe and secure digital future for us all. Next year will mark 20 years since the Tunis phase of the World Summit on the Information Society, otherwise known as WSIS. This version of WSIS was to work towards a people-centred, inclusive and development-oriented information society. And that 20-year review will provide the opportunity to reflect on the broader state of digitalisation and development right across the world and progress against related sustainable development goals. For the internet governance community represented today, the review will provide an opportunity to seek agreement on a renewed mandate for UN IGF, something I know many of us here care deeply about. I'm really pleased that today's programme will provide a timely opportunity to discuss both multi-stakeholder digital governance and the WSIS Plus 20 process. So as I look across the room, I'm reminded of the unique value of IGF in bringing together, a wide variety of voices. And I'm also so pleased to see many of you in the room and online, and I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts as the day progresses. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to this year's funding partners for their support of UK IGF. These are ICANN, Internet Society UK and VeriSign. I'd also like to thank the Multi-Stakeholder Steering Committee for devoting all their time and knowledge to ensuring UK IGF addresses the topics of the day and that we have a diverse and expert line of speakers. So with that, I'd like to officially call open the UK IGF and hand back to our compares, Bobby and Archie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And absolutely, it's going to be a very interesting event, and so brilliant to see such a diverse range of stakeholders here today. So without further ado, I would now like to welcome the Right Honourable Baroness Jones, the Under-Secretary of State for the Future of Digital Economy and Online Safety at the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Paul, for your opening remarks, which were very pertinent. And I'm delighted to be here at the 2024 UK Internet Governance Forum and to see so many Internet stakeholders here. It was 20 years ago that the idea of the Internet Governance Forum first emerged from what was then called the World Summit on the Information Society. And I wanted to start by taking a minute to think about just how much has changed in that time. At the beginning of the new millennium, the Information Society was still coming into view. Today, we can see that society clearly. The internet has transformed almost every part of our lives. Most of us can access our bank account anywhere, at any time, and transferring money just takes seconds. Social media and video calls have given grandparents back precious time with their grandchildren, no matter how far away they live. Young people live in a world where they can find thousands of jobs just at the click of a mouse. And at the same time, almost every person will be forced to contend with the new dangers on the online world. One thing is certain, the way our internet is governed, the way we balance those opportunities and risks will have a profound implication for all of us. And an open and inclusive space where all of us, government, the private sector and civil society can come together to shape the future of the internet is more important than ever. That space is, of course, fundamentally global. Next month, the UK will be a proud voice for global collaboration at the UN Internet Governance Forum in Saudi Arabia. Here in the UK, we have the opportunity to tackle some of the most pressing issues which will define the shape of the information society which it takes in years to come. And it would be remiss of me not to take the chance to thank Nominate and Paul for organising such a brilliant event. But if the internet is to be a force for good in the world, then the opportunities it offers must be available to all. To build an information society where everyone can see the place for themselves, and digital inclusion must be a top priority. That means ensuring that everyone, no matter what their circumstances, has access to the skills and support to participate in a modern digital society and the confidence to seize those opportunities that the internet offers. That means affordable, reliable internet connectivity with devices that work for people that use them. It means ensuring that people know how to meet their own needs and to stay safe online. And it means providing accessible digital services that save people time and money, whilst ensuring that there are exceptional pathways available to those who need them. And it means, perhaps most importantly of all, making sure that people understand how the internet can benefit them, with the trust that comes from knowing that the right protections for privacy and security are in place. We know that digital exclusion disproportionately impacts certain demographics, including older people. For example, Age UK found that 37% of those aged over 65 who want to be online more often did not trust the internet. That's why we'll be working closely with civil society and with local authorities to ensure that our approach can reach those people and meet their needs. Digital inclusion is where we start, but we know that people will not want to seize the opportunities of the online world unless they are confident they are safe. We're clear that the internet is not a lawless space. The law applies online as it does offline, and the same rights that people have offline must be protected online. This government is committed to protecting people online, and the Online Safety Act is a crucial first step in achieving this. The Act protects citizens from illegal content and tackles criminal activity online, including the illegal spread of disinformation and abusive content. Social media companies and search services now have new duties to ensure the safety of the users on their platforms, making them accountable for the content shared and the interactions that occur. The new laws extend to all companies that allow users to share and post content online or to interact with each other, regardless of whether the companies are based in the UK or abroad. In December, Ofcom will publish their illegal harms codes and guidance. These will be laid before Parliament, at which point tech companies will have to start assessing the risk of illegal content appearing on their platforms. We expect the codes to be fully in effect by spring next year, and Ofcom will then be able to take robust enforcement action against those failing to do so. The child safety duties will be published in spring 2025, and the government is working to ensure they are fully in effect by summer 2025. But companies should not wait for the law to come into force. We are clear that they should take those proactive measures now, and we will support them in doing so. Ofcom will have extensive powers to assess and enforce compliance within the framework, providing clear guidance through their codes of practice on how providers can fulfil their safety duties. An extensive programme of work by Ofcom aims to make regulation accessible and compliance more attainable. This includes a new digital support service for regulated firms, partnership with trade bodies like Tech UK, and a comprehensive communications campaign to raise awareness of the Act. Because the importance of online safety cannot be overstated, we are clear that the Online Safety Act is a major first step in protecting adults and children online. And as the internet continues to evolve, we are committed to building on it a better future for all. This includes tackling misinformation and disinformation. From COVID-19 to the UK summer riots, misinformation and disinformation now represent a pervasive threat to our democracy and our society. Tackling that threat requires a multifaceted, whole-of-society approach. The Online Safety Act will be a key tool in that mission, requiring services to tackle misinformation and disinformation where it's illegal or harmful to children, from content or for content that might be harmful to them. This includes the new false communications offence, which captures communications where the sender knows information to be false but sends it intending to cause harm, and the foreign interference offence, tackling state-sponsored disinformation and state-linked interference online. Our work on media literacy will also help educate and empower users to increase society's resilience to mis- and disinformation. We're continuing to engage with the social media companies to ensure their policies are fit for purpose, consistently enforced, and protect freedom of expression. Given the scale and complexity of the changing information landscape, the UK is keen to work with international partners to find common solutions to the kind of information threats that are facing democracies around the world. We hope our thinking can contribute towards new global approaches to threats on information integrity and that support democratic values and promote a free, open and secure internet. AI has also brought new challenges to the way in which we look at governance in the digital sphere. This is the technology that more than any other promises to transform our society in the decades to come. It will have profound implications for every one of us. As global AI governance continues to take shape, an open, inclusive approach will be absolutely critical. We will continue to promote AI governance that is targeted, adaptable, inclusive, deliverable, and fair, ensuring all AI brings tangible benefits to every citizen. At the same time, we remain resolutely committed to mitigating the risks that the technology can bring, and our shared values, human rights, freedom, and democracy will always be our foundation. It's clear that governments cannot achieve these aims on their own. The wider multi-stakeholder community have critical roles to play. Though the internet has changed profoundly over the last 2 decades, we can learn a lot from the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance that was agreed in WSIS nearly 20 years ago. The UK has a long-standing commitment to supporting that multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. We believe all stakeholders have a role to play in how the internet is run. It's this open, distributed framework for internet governance that has enabled the internet to grow and develop so quickly and successfully. It now offers enormous economic and social opportunities to people throughout the world. The multi-stakeholder model is crucial for producing effective, collaborative solutions to complex problems by drawing on diverse perspectives. It also allows issues to be resolved by those closest to the problem and with the relevant expertise. The UK IGF takes place as we're about to enter a critical year for internet governance. The UN recently agreed a new global digital compact, which was passed in September at the UN General Assembly. And we're pleased that the compact says clearly that internet governance should continue to be multi-stakeholder. Now we're about to move into the 20-year review of WSIS, a critical milestone for anyone with a stake in the future of internet governance. Our aim are to maintain a free, open, secure, interoperable global internet, to ensure an internet environment which supports innovation, investment, and open markets, to promote sustainable development and effective multi-stakeholder governance model that serves the global community. We will continue to oppose the kind of top-down intergovernmental model that has been promoted by some authoritarian regimes around the world. The multi-stakeholder model was the great achievement of the WSIS 20 years ago. It recognised that no single organisation or stakeholder could or should control the internet. We want to ensure that all stakeholders are able to play a role in the review, and that we hear clearly the views of the private sector, the technical community, and civil society. For example, I'm delighted that Nominet has taken an initiative to join with the counterparts from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand through the Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism in order to help ensure the technical community is clearly heard. The WSIS is also developing a development agenda, including a set of action lines which set out in detail a shared global commitment to bridge the digital divide. We need to use the WSIS review to make sure that the development agenda is up to date and fit for purpose. We'll support the aim to connect that 1/3 of the world's population which does not yet have access. And we'll support efforts to ensure WSIS' agenda keeps pace with the opportunities and challenges of new technology. I encourage all UK stakeholders to work together to participate effectively in the review of WSIS and to work with us in government as we prepare for this important UN review. We need to continue to work together to maintain and develop a free, open and secure internet for all. I started today by talking about how much the internet has changed over the last 20 years. The speed at which AI has transformed our economy and our society in the last 2 years shows that digital technologies retain their ability to surprise, to disrupt, and to shape our world. So just try to imagine where the internet could take us in the next 20 years to come. Together, we have an opportunity to shape that journey and to ensure that every citizen can benefit. My thanks again to Nominet for organising today's event, and I wish everyone a great UK IGF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Jones. Yes, of course, if you'd like to. Yes, I think if the microphone's on, that should work. Does anybody have any questions to get off? Yeah.
Thank you very much for an excellent speech and a great way to start the day. I'm Ian Corby from the Age Verification Providers Association. I think the two things that are going to make we require for the internet are obviously trust in it and practicality. And I think a key part of trust is knowing who you're dealing with on the internet and therefore digital identity. I'm very pleased to see the new government picking up where the last one left off on taking forward digital identity online. But have you looked at the opportunity to also follow up on their consultation on using a digital proof of age in real life as well? And basically making sure that when you use a digital ID, whether it's online or in person, it has equivalent standing to pulling out a tatty old passport.
Oh, maybe, yeah, that might be better with the microphone. Is that okay?
So, thank you. That's a really important question. And one thing I've learned since being in this job, well, of course, I absolutely agree with you about the importance of trust, absolutely crucial. But also the other thing that I've learned is the speed with which age verification techniques have moved at pace. One thing we didn't want Ofcom to do is to specify too quickly, this is what an age verification system ought to look like, because in a year it'll be out of date because you have become more and more sophisticated than governance can be, if you like. The private sector are moving ahead with all of this. So we will need to have age verification underpinning the effects of the Online Safety Act, absolutely necessary. But I think we need to find a way to word the requirements so that it's the best in class of what people are able to do. So some platforms are able to do it in a more sophisticated way than others. That's great. We will expect you to do that. Others have other face recognition techniques and so on. Great, we want you to use those. So we want to go with the mood, with the trend, to make sure, and Ofcom will need to make sure that they oversee and support this system. But we want to make sure that any standards that we set are the minimum and that people can flourish, because the more you're able to provide proper age verification, the more people will have trust with the services and the more they'll use them. So, if parents can have absolute confidence that the services their children are using have been age verified, they're more likely to allow their child to have a mobile phone, for example. So it goes without saying that it's absolutely crucial, and it's a really good question.
Gentleman here.
Good morning, Under Secretary. Neil Sharpley, Federation of Small Businesses. May I ask you a digital economy question, please? Hundreds of thousands of small businesses and large businesses also trade using online platforms. Over the last 10 years, there have been various attempts to regulate or control some of the mechanisms that exist. And whilst you rightly say that the law applies online, that is meaningless unless there are mechanisms to make sure that it does apply. Can I invite DCIT, and I've talked to some of your colleagues, to engage with the Federation and others about creating an effective and cost-effective mechanism for resolving online dispute resolutions or online disputes in relation to platforms and creating a mechanism or a framework for fair business practices in relation to online commerce and also non-online commerce in line with some of the European jurisdictions. At the moment, the focus has been on protecting consumers, whereas in fact, most of the damage is sustained by businesses inflicting difficulties for other businesses. If we want to achieve growth, we must tackle these problems. They are now urgent, and the last 10 years has not produced the solution that we all desire. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, we're very happy to carry on engaging with the Federation of Small Businesses on these issues. I think the point that you make is absolutely right, that you need to have fair trading opportunities online. And the Digital Economy Act that we passed last year was meant to start that process where the CMA are looking at the bigger platforms and making sure that they do provide fair access. Now, that's just starting its process. It's working through the system, but that should certainly help that there will be a new requirement on the online, the larger tech companies, big online platforms, to provide a fair space. But you make another point, I think, about online disputes and how they should be resolved. And I don't think we should wait for that to be dealt with by legislation. It needs to create a culture. We need to create a culture where that happens automatically. And if there are mechanisms, and in my history, I've been involved on several ombudsman schemes that do just that. And if there is an ombudsman scheme of that kind that we can develop that would allow that space where those sort of disputes can be resolved, then I would certainly welcome that opportunity. But I'd be very happy to talk to you about how that would work.
Baroness, I'm John Warburton from the University of Surrey, but I'm speaking on my own behalf as a journalist. I know you have a long career in good governance, and now I want to ask you about the potential of the Online Safety Act, as Labour might revise it, to cope with disinformation. And I would suggest a good question might be, what business is it of a government that's here today and maybe voted out of office in a few years to censor disinformation? A government has political aims, but on tap you have career journalists, career scientists who make fact-checking and research their whole lifetime's work. Aren't they in a better position to counter disinformation? What do you think?
Do you know, I think this is a case for a dissertation rather than a quick question. But it's a very good question you pose. And firstly, I should say I don't think that this government or any government thinks that they are in charge of deciding what is information, information and disinformation. And I don't think we should do that. Which is why we've tried. Our attempt has been to say that. The arm's length organisations like Ofcom should play a role in doing all of that. But the other important point here is we do need, and I think this is your point, a robust journalism, and we need to make sure that that is protected. And there is, my colleague Chris Bryant, Minister Bryant, is very much looking at this issue. We need to make sure that online messages and people who deliberately distort things online can be counteracted by good journalism. I'll just give you an example. I was talking to somebody from Reach, the Reach, which organises all the local newspapers, who were telling me that during the Southport riots, if you typed in Southport riots onto, an internet search, you would get comments from people in Zimbabwe or Turkey or whatever before you ever got to the actual stories that the local journalists who were on the ground who'd actually witnessed things actually were posting. So we need to make sure that the good stories, the honest stories, get to the top of those search engines, and that's a big issue for us. But we are absolutely, I can't tell you, I'm dealing with a question on this in the House on Monday. This is absolutely front and central, because if we don't get this right, then we're going to be living in a dystopian world where nobody knows what the truth is. So we absolutely have to rely on journalists.
Just to flag, we've got 15 minutes left for this section. Has anybody else got any questions? Any online questions?
I'm only coming back for a second bite at the cherry because nobody else is up for it. I did also touch on the use of digital ID in person. You know, I mean, kids these days, they don't leave the house with a wallet or even keys. You know, they just go out with a phone, and they want to be able to go into Sainsbury's and just buy some beer using digital ID. And of course, if you've got digital ID for that purpose, you're more likely to have it for online purposes. The Home Office did do a consultation on this. I just wondered if you've been sort of briefed on that and whether that's something you're looking into. Thanks.
Not only am I looking into it, but I'm about to start a piece of legislation which I hope is going to deal with it. So the new data bill, which is just about to start in the Lords in a couple of weeks' time, will provide the mechanisms to provide that for a data ID. I mean, there's two things here. My colleagues in DCIT are working at pace on the idea of a one login for access for public services, which I think will be transformative. So you will actually just have a very quick digital identity, and then once you've done it once, instead of every time you want to deal with the government, you know, if you're applying for a passport or for a driving license or welfare benefits, you will already have proved your identity, and you won't have to fill out all those forms and do it again and again, which is hugely frustrating for everybody. So, firstly, one login, I think, will make a huge difference. But secondly, we will provide through digital verification services the opportunity for people who want to access in the private sector. It might be, you know, that they're applying for a loan, or they want to send their details to their landlord for a rental agreement or whatever. Equally, there will be that digital ID that has been developed, and it will be hopefully, and this is something we need to scrutinise very carefully, the people who are authorising that identity will be properly verified, and we will have a trust mark to make sure that that is a trusted arrangement. So it should all be in the data use and access bill, which is just about to start. And I hope when everybody sees that, they will think the government's done a good job on that.
Thank you. I believe we've got two questions online, so we might take those together.
Yeah, sure. So our first question is from Suvash Karka, who is from the United Network for Social Entrepreneurship. And he has asked, how are we moving for critical infrastructure protection and to roadmap it, particularly UK digital infrastructure?
Right. Now, does he mean online? I mean, does he mean tech, or does he mean physical infrastructure?
Suvash, do you want to come on live and ask a question directly so you can clarify that point? We can bring you into the room if you unmute and turn your camera on.
Yeah, I'm listening. I'm in digital infrastructure especially.
Okay, so is your question, how is the government kind of protecting UK digital infrastructure?
Yeah, the thing is, especially the bad actors are targeting the critical infrastructure and digital infrastructure elsewhere. So my question especially is how we are going to protect UK's digital infrastructure. Especially, what will be the roadmap from the government side? That is my question.
Okay.
Well, isn't that in part what you're doing here? I think if we're talking about the internet, for example, then we are reliant on those people who are providing those sort of multi-stakeholder arrangements to ensure that people who access do get proper, secure access to those services. But there is another angle on all of this, which may or may not answer your question, which is, again, going back to the data bill. We've got a new initiative called NUAR, the National Underground Asset Register, which is looking at the physical infrastructure. So when I say that, I mean broadband cabling, the masts for mobile phones, all of that physical infrastructure, and is being mapped out as we speak. And the National Underground Asset Register, which is a huge amount of work already happening, will enable people to access in a secure way all that physical infrastructure, which we will have to rely on to ensure that all those services can continue and they can't be disrupted by people trying to blow up the cabling or whatever else they might do. I don't know if that's I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry if it doesn't, but by all means, if you don't feel like I did, then you could drop me a note.
Great. I've had a few more questions online. So we have one from Maria Palmieri, and that is, does the Labour government anticipate delivering the Online Safety Act as has been laid out without any additional regulatory burdens in the future of this Parliament? That's quite a long one if you want me to repeat it.
Right. Okay. Well, I think the short answer to this is our priority is to implement the Online Safety Act, which has already passed as an act. So we're working with Ofcom to roll it out. So I think when I set out in my speech, there are timescales for some aspects of it to be rolled out. But our first priority is to make sure that the Online Safety Act is rolled out as it is, as fast as we possibly can. People are getting very frustrated that it's taken a long time, but within the legislation itself, it was meant to be a phased introduction, and that's what's happening now. The Secretary of State has said, I think publicly a couple of times now, that we will, going forward, have to keep it under review. As new technologies come on stream, as new threats come on stream, we might need to look at whether other bits of legislation are necessary. But we're not going to revive the Online Safety Act anytime soon, but it might be that we do need to take other steps to make sure that all the things that we've talked about a safe and secure online activities can continue. So it will be kept under review, but we don't have any clear plans yet to introduce any other legislation.
One more, and then I'll go to the gentleman over here. Yeah.
So it's another legislation related one. So this is from Robert Can, who's at Full Fact. And his question is, Clause 123 of the Data Bill aims to improve access for researchers to internet companies' data for means of online safety. Is it the government's intention that this measure will cover the widespread legal but harmful misinformation that affects adults? So that's about whether the measure in Clause 123 of the Data Bill will address legal but harmful content and misinformation that affects adults.
Well, I have to say I haven't got Clause 123 in front of me at the moment. But in terms of research access, then the first thing to say about that is that we are looking again at what the European model is, and by and large, we're trying to make sure that we are aligned with what's happening in Europe on that issue of access for researchers. In terms of legal but harmful, this, as the gentleman will know, has been a hugely contentious issue, and at the moment we don't have any plans to revisit legal but harmful. It was originally in the Online Safety Act. Many of you will know this, and then it was taken out at the last moment. But we are aware that it's an ongoing issue, but it's not in our intention to review it at this stage.
Baroness, thank you for your very enlightening opening speech. My name is Charles Mock, and I'm an Internet Society trustee, and I'm also a researcher at Stanford University, but on my piece here on my personal behalf. My question is actually about the recent passage at the United Nations for the Cybercrime Convention. As you know, it's causing great concerns among civil society worldwide about the fact that it will probably make it much easier for authoritarian governments to carry out, demanding data from global tech companies and carrying out transnational repression against dissidents in other countries outside of the jurisdictions and so on. So I wonder what the UK government's position might be on this, and what it might be still trying to do, hopefully with other governments in the free world, as this particular convention is entering the stage of, going up to the UN General Assembly and getting implemented in many other countries or supposedly globally. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, we are in constant contact with conversations with other allied governments on these issues, and I don't want to say anything here that might upset those discussions. So bear with me. We are aware that it's a very, very sensitive issue. We are working with our online colleagues. We take a lead on a lot of these issues. We are seen as being one of the leading spokesperson for the free world, if you like, and so we are continuing to discuss that issue.
Good morning. I'm Hannah Perry from Demos. Thank you for your comments and was really pleased to hear your emphasis on supporting journalists in response to disinformation. I think one of the things we were pleased to see in the Digital Competition Act was an emphasis on fair bargaining between news providers and social media platforms. But some of the recommendations that were made in the Ken Cross review that haven't yet been taken up, we think also deserve more attention. For example, the creation of a Public Interest News Institute that would facilitate governance and also fair and kind of multi-stakeholder approaches to funding for local news and perhaps the creation of local news funds. Is this something that you might consider or welcome a further conversation on?
Well, can I say this is, as I said, a huge issue. And my colleagues, Chris Bryant and Baroness Clark, Minister Clark, have been working on this. They had a roundtable a couple of weeks ago. They know that we need to come forward with some proposals on it. I don't want to prejudge that. All I would say is this was an issue that was on the previous government's agenda, and somehow they seem to have passed the buck to us. And the solutions are not going to be simple, but we are absolutely working on it, and we want to get this right because, as we were saying earlier, the protection, and we need independent journalists for a free society, a democratic society. So we need to find a way to make sure that they're protected and carry on having a voice. But I don't want to say that we've come up with a particular model yet because I know this is still in discussion.
About 5 more minutes, so maybe a couple more questions.
Thank you very much, Right Honourable Mrs. Jones. Following up with what Subhas was mentioning earlier about the critical infrastructure, such as we know, like ambulance, national grid, and in all the places they have had cyber attack. And I wonder that whether the government is leveling up to these threats, which are very critical, such as healthcare and electricity.
Well, yes. I mean, this is first and foremost on our mind. Obviously, our national security people are very, very aware of all of this. We're in constant discussion. We're constantly measuring threats, from international threats, but also threats within the UK, and trying to make sure that we anticipate where they might come from. So it is absolutely on our wavelengths daily. I don't want to say too much about what our national security advisors are saying, but we are briefed on this regularly. We are doing what we can to make sure that the systems are safe as well as we can do. And all I can say is that whatever can be done is being done on this. We've got the best intelligence. Whatever we can, we are doing on this. It's a very important issue.
Any more questions on the line or any more in the room?
You spoke earlier on digital identity in the context of age and online safety and things of that kind. About 1 in 5 of the UK population are not capable of, quotes, proving their identity because they don't have a current passport. They don't have a current driving license. Increasingly, youngsters do not learn how to drive in inner cities. Therefore, they can't, you name it, they can't use it. And yet the world is awash with digital identities used by all sorts of people for all sorts of purposes. And most of them, many of them, are internationally recognized as opposed to nationally. Is there any virtue in using the IGF to try and map who actually uses which digital identities for what purposes and how they're proved, the validity, etc., behind them? Because for somebody trying to provide guidance to small firms, to politicians, to, what is the state of play? Where are things going to go? Given that no government department trusts the digital identities issued by any other government department, which is why we never had identity cards, we never, etc. Given the problems, is there virtue in your department encouraging I would call it a simple mapping exercise, but it's nowhere near as simple as that, but a mapping exercise on who uses, recognizes which identities already since information of that kind usually leads to rationalisation as people cull the ones that they're maintaining where somebody else has got a better one.
Okay. Well, first thing to say, and I think I said it in my opening speech, is digital inclusion is absolutely crucial to us. So the 1 in 5 that you said can't prove their identity. We can't. We're not in the game of creating a society where 20% of the population cannot participate, whether it's accessing public services or accessing private services. So this is absolutely crucial piece of work for us, and we are not going to give up on it because otherwise it's not sustainable. Our plans are, and all the great advantages of the digital world. If only a proportion of people can use them, then that is not a society that I would be happy in being a part of a government for. So I hope I can come back in a couple of years' time and show some real progress on that, because that is really, really important. In terms of digital verification, again, this is the thing that's moving fast very quickly. A number of the companies that we've been looking at, and we are going to create a regime, we're going to have a digital verification team within DCIT who will oversee that whole framework. But a number of the companies that are currently provided digital verification services are international companies. They're not UK companies. So they're doing it elsewhere as well. So if there are good lessons to be learned from, if they're doing it in Australia and it works well, we certainly don't have a closed mind to that. We want to, again, have the best in class, but we do want to make sure, equally, we want to make sure that if they're operating in some countries which we find slightly worrying, that they can't use or transfer data from one country to another and so on, the sense that I mean. So yes, we want to have a very robust digital verification system, and some of it will have international connotations, and we want to learn from the best. It's a hugely fast-moving thing, but actually, it's the moment somebody's data gets leaked because of it, the whole edifice will crumble. So it's got to be absolutely watertight and robust, and that's what we're aiming for.
Brilliant. I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much for your questions, and of course, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So next up, our next panel will be focusing on the question of how we can foster digital inclusion in the UK. So I believe they should be coming in a second, but our Oh, perfect. Okay, so our panel chair is Professor Ellen Hesper, the Professor of Socio-Digital Inequalities at the London School of Economics. We've got Lord Clement Jones, the House of Lords Liberal Democrat spokesperson for Science, Innovation and Technology. Professor Lizzie Coles-Kemp, the head of the Department of Information Security at Royal Holloway, University of London. And finally, we've got Helen Milner, OBE, the Group Chief Executive of the Good Things Foundation. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me see if I can get the technology to work. I'll wait until everybody sits. I think on behalf of all the panelists, I will say thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to share our knowledge and expertise and ideas around digital inclusion and how we can foster it in the UK. We will organize this panel roundtable discussion in a way that I'll first ask my colleagues to introduce themselves on the panel, and then we will have 2 questions. I wonder if we can, they said they might be up on the, there we are. 2 rounds of questions. One, we'll start with talking about what we already know and what works for whom. And each of us will share our ideas and knowledge about this. And then we'll have a second round of questions around what to do in the next 10 years, or what can we do, and is it possible to eradicate digital exclusion? And then after that, we'll open the floor to questions. We'll try to respond to some of the points made on the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I'm going to be a bit strict on sticking to time, so we have enough time for questions also from the people in the room. So I'll start. Helen, would you like to just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, and then we'll ask everybody else.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Milner. I'm the Group Chief Executive at Good Things Foundation. We're a national and international digital inclusion charity. We work with thousands of hyperlocal community organisations, so small local charities, community hubs, food banks, job centres, libraries. I call it a big club with a shared vision because if you're interested in digital inclusion, if you're supporting excluded people in communities, then you can be in the club. It's all free. And predominantly what we do is we work with that network to help them to engage and support local people. So we work at scale. In things like the National Data Bank, so providing 500,000 SIMs for free internet connectivity to people who can't afford it, free refurbished devices that we get from private and public sector into the hands of people, but also of core skills and confidence. We work with partners like Nominet and Vodafone, Virgin Media, O2 and Accenture to make sure that we can make sure everything is free for people and for communities. And our goal is to help 1 million people over 3 years through our group outcomes to make sure that people are digitally able, equal and safe so that they can be happier, healthier and better off. And I wanted to say that because I think it's really important we don't just focus on the digital, we focus on the impact that that then has on people's lives.
Thank you very much, Helen. Lizzie.
Thank you. I'm an academic and I specialise in digital security and privacy for socioeconomically excluded groups. Department now has 3 people specialising in that area, and I think that shows how inclusive and accessible security and privacy has really grown as a topic. For the last 16 years, I've been working with communities to look at how community support works for safer digital access. We're looking at the types of threats that these groups particularly face and what that means for the design of technologies. And we've also been working on how technology, security and privacy technologies can be modified for groups in this position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Tim.
So sorry, already failed the digital test. I'm Tim Clement-Jones. I'm the Lib Dem Science, Innovation and Technology spokesperson in the House of Lords. I used to be what it said on the tin, which was our digital spokesperson, and I slightly regret that I've had to, in a sense, expand the name of the title because digital is what I'm really interested in. I've been an officer of the formerly, it was called the Data Poverty All-Party Group, now the Digital Inclusion All-Party Group for quite a few years. And to my horror, I found that I was had my photograph at the very front of this report from the all-party group because I was the only person still left in Parliament as one of the officers. But that doesn't mean to say that the report isn't very important. And it was our third and rather important report as a kind of wrap-up at the end of the last Parliament, which illustrated some of the lack of progress. But as well as everything else, I'm co-chair and I founded the all-party AI group in Parliament because I thought there was far too little understanding. And I think writ large, that is very true across the country of a lot of areas of data and digital. And we have a big job to do.
Thank you very much, Tim. I guess I should introduce myself as well before we start the question round. So I'm Ellen Helsper. I'm a professor of social and digital inequalities at the London School of Economics in the Media and Communications Department. And I am also leading a program on the politics of inequality at the International Inequalities Institute there. I'm also the director of the PhD program. And I have to say that we've seen a real increase in interest from applicants from around the world in actually studying this phenomenon in all its complexity. And I have myself been researching the links between historical and social and economic inequalities and marginalization and inequalities in an increasingly digital society globally, using a variety of different methods. Most of that work has taken place under the umbrella of the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which is a project that develops frameworks measurement tools and kind of toolkits to better understand who is most at risk of not achieving the benefits, which is obviously important, part of inclusion, but also very much at looking at who is more at risk of the kind of more negative aspects of digitization. The Baroness has already mentioned some of these. We look at this kind of holistically, so from studying systematic inequalities or differences between regions and people from different backgrounds in access, skills. Helen already mentioned that it's important to go beyond just the basics, right? But also in terms of for what kind of content is available, for whom, by whom is it made, and how do people engage with these technologies, and the different outcomes, you know, both the positive and the negative ones. We do surveys, interviews, we map regional and local inequalities and see how they change over time and what happens when people do an intervention in a region. Do people's lives improve if it's a digital intervention? Really important that for us, it's not about individuals being on or offline or being able to engage or not engage in a meaningful way, but it's about systematic differences between groups of people where policies and interventions can really make a difference to have that sustainable change and improvement in terms of socioeconomic and social kind of inequalities in increasingly digital societies. So that's my introduction. As you can see here on the screen, our first question that we will be discussing and giving our ideas about is, what do we already know about digital inclusion in the UK? What has and has not worked, and for whom? And I would like to invite Tim, if you would like to start. I will time so that we get everybody through their points on time.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. And also, I think to follow Maggie Jones as well, because I think it shows a seriousness in government, which perhaps we haven't had quite before. So I do preface that I'm not yet in full oppositional mode. I'm still waiting for action, but I do think that there is a seriousness of purpose which is emerging. Whether the money to put behind the strategy is emerging is another question, and I think that's where the jury is out currently. But I think, you know, everybody in this room will be completely on board with the fact that access to data, digital devices affects every aspect of our lives. Our ability to learn, to work, to connect with online public services, to access necessary services from banking, healthcare, and to socialize and connect with family and friends. But I think it's taken quite some time for parliamentarians to wake up to these issues, mainly because they took time to wake up to what was happening more broadly in the digital economy. Just look at the Online Harms Bill, which we talked about, Maggie talked about just a few minutes ago. And that took years to get on the statute book because there was a lack of understanding about the urgency that was needed in that respect. And I do pay tribute to Darren Jones, who is now the keeper of the purse in the Treasury, who founded what was called the Data Poverty All-Party Group, now the Digital Inclusion All-Party Group, in identifying that there was a serious gap in Parliament in terms of knowledge about digital inclusion and data poverty. And I think digital inclusion is a better way of describing it, because it's not just about access to connectivity and technology, it's also about skills and understanding, which is crucial. And our last report, which I just waved, does express some of the issues. And it's not just the product of the pandemic, although clearly it exacerbated a lot of the digital exclusion issues. Now, the best report that I've found, strangely enough, and I'm not a great believer in always banging the drum for the House of Lords, is the Lords Communications and Digital Select Committee's report on digital inclusion back last year in June. And they highlighted the issues. Their report, strangely enough, was called Digital Exclusion. And they noted that 1.7 million households had no broadband or mobile internet access. 2.4 million adults were unable to complete a single basic task to get online, and 5 million workers will be acutely underskilled in basic skills by 2050. 2030. And they identified that broadband social tariffs, for instance, which of course were welcomed at the time, suffer from persistently low levels of uptake, with only 5% of eligible households signed up. And 4 in 10 households don't meet the minimum digital living standard. And crucially, 1 in 4 households with children have parents missing the critical skills for understanding and managing digital risk. So there's a whole raft of metrics by which we can easily identify that this is a major issue. And, you know, the Local Government Association's report on the role of councils in tackling digital exclusion showed a very strong relationship between having fixed broadband and higher earnings and educational achievement. So the impact of digital exclusion is absolutely crucial. And I think the other aspect is the question of digital literacy. This is crucial if we're to ensure that people are in the driving seat, where increasingly, for instance, the use of AI is concerned. And it's very good to see that the next panel is about discussing AI regulation. And there's much good that technology can do, but we must ensure that we know who has power over our children, what values are in play when that power is exercised. And this is vital for their future and the proper functioning of our society.
Could I ask you to wrap up so that
and
we
the
have time for
maintenance
the
of public trust. Absolutely, I could go on forever. But I think the summary is that digital inclusion is critical to the future fair and democratic functioning of our society. And we need a concerted local and national effort to ensure it. So I'm looking for an update on a national digital inclusion strategy, which scandalously hasn't been updated since 2014.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So my position is always very much at the ground level, how we do digital inclusion and how we do that safely. I think, as we've just heard, a lot of really strong movements in terms of regulation, in terms of awareness, in terms of discussion, in terms of bringing groups together. And I see that on the ground in terms of doing. What I think we've done well is to raise it as an issue, to raise it as something that we need to do something about. And that's been very much followed up with toolkits and with frameworks. And Ellen describes some of the work that they've been doing. And I know that Helen does that on the ground. And that's really, really visible. So now we do talk about accessible and inclusive security and privacy technologies in a way that we wouldn't have done 5 years ago. We're thinking about this as a topic when we design access control into systems authentication, how we prove who we are, what we can do when we're online. So I think that's great. I think what's also really where I think we've also really moved forward is that we think about what does it mean to design for diversity. And what we see on the ground is we see co-production, we see co-design coming in, and I think that's also really, really important. So I think that works well. Where I think we've still got a ways to go is I think that the implementation, at least for the work that we see, is not systemic. It's not systematically done. So what that means is that we quite often look at design of the technologies that I work with, might be digital identity, it might be access control technologies. And then we have a working group on diversity and inclusion. And that's really useful because it brings out the issues. But we don't look at how our core design practices can be inclusive, can represent a broader range of diversity, can really think about these accessibility issues. So in the user journeys that we design, in the archetypes of the users, we tend to think about this in a slightly siloed, separate way. So there's a really interesting question about how we bring that in to the mainstream design. And I suspect that has a lot to do, not with how we do it, and because we know how to do it, but it's about the economic and market models that underpin those technologies. How do we want to bake in diversity and inclusion from the ground up? And I think that's still a challenge for us. I think we've also got to ask ourselves, what is the goal here? Have we got it in our minds that we want to to develop uses of technology that are independent users in the way that we conceive, perhaps, of what that use should be. Independent, capable, skills. But the groups I work with, supported access, assisted access is what they want. It's how they want to go forward. So the way that some of the groups that I work with conceptualize access isn't just about independent use. It's often about co-use. It's often about collective use. And I think we need to take that on board. I think that there are a range of different types of inclusion. And I think we need to think about what that means or what that means for the end goal of inclusive design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Helen.
So on what do we know? We know a lot. I'm sure the three of us could probably stay here all day telling you what we know. One of the things we do at Good Things Foundation, we print this annual Digital Nation, which has kind of key stats and facts about digital inclusion. If you just search for Digital Nation on Good Things Foundation website, you'll find it. Tim's actually highlighted some of the key numbers on there. But one that I find absolutely shocking is that 33%, so 1/3 of people who are offline find it difficult to engage with the NHS. So the NHS, something we hold absolutely dear in this country, a universal service for everyone, but 1/3 of those people who are offline find it difficult to engage with it. So right now we have a 2-tier public service, and how wonderful was it to hear Baroness Jones say that it's absolutely crucial that digital inclusion is at the top of the agenda for the government, because it's going to absolutely underpin so many things. We know that interventions at the hyperlocal level work, right? So we know that it works not just because of trust, not just because of the support that they can offer, but because they reach the people who are excluded. There are still people who come to one of our partner digital inclusion hubs and say, I don't know how to use the internet and I heard you could help me. But there aren't that many of them. That mostly we work with these thousands of digital inclusion hubs, local partners who are already engaging with people because they don't speak English as a first language and they want to have help with their English language, because they are absolutely on the breadline. They're coming for support, for food, for housing support, because they're coming because they have to get a job, they have to apply for benefits online. So it's a necessity, or they're already helping them. So one of the things that my question was, what's worked and what's not worked? Some of the not worked is, well, some of it's kind of emerging. So this is about actually how do we make sure that we fuel the flames of what's currently emerging. So, for example, an increased number of GP practices, hospitals, maternity nurses. We have 58 maternity nurses working on digital inclusion right now, because their day job is to help women who are pregnant. But they have so many apps and so many wonderful things that they can have online, but they realize that lots of those mums-to-be just could not afford the internet, so they can give them free SIMs. I was talking recently to the woman who is the health inequalities lead at a hospital trust. And they have joined the National Digital Inclusion Network, which basically means they can access the services. It's all free. But she did that because they have an online patients portal. And she was too often talking to patients who couldn't access the portal. And all of the good stuff that they were doing was on that portal. And she said to me that, do the people who design these portals know, do they ask themselves the question, who is helping people to use the portal? And she said, because they don't ask themselves that question. They have an absolute belief that every portal is just magically accessed by people. So that's about skills, it's about confidence, it's about affordability, so if you just don't have a device. So those local interventions work, but we need to ensure that we are doing this with embedded, I mean, you talked about tools, but embedded interventions. I also want to shout out to the private sector where Virgin Money, for example, all Virgin Money branches are local data banks. So that's where they can get free SIMs. And again, the people who are doing that are bank employees. They're people who are there to help people to access their banking. But because of their brand, because of their high street presence, that the local job centres, the local councils are signposting people there because they know that they can provide them with free connectivity when they come across people with free connectivity. And so this is absolutely about that multi-stakeholder, the cross-sector partnership that really needs to work. But I think there's so much. There's loads of really great stuff. A massive shout out to all those communities who are working so hard. But I still think that we need to accelerate and to amplify this.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. So it's my turn, last but great to follow all this because I think it covers many of the things that I think we do indeed already know. I mean, we can be optimistic in some ways because obviously many more people are online, especially in terms of simple access. During the pandemic, there was a huge effort to get especially young people who had to follow education, but also a lot of other efforts for people who couldn't reach the services that they desperately needed to survive. So there has been a great effort. UK is also leading in terms of the number of organizations that are involved, the policy involvement, the thinking around it in academia. And I would say it's a global player in that. So I think that's definitely positive. So while there are all these improvements, I think it's important to ask the second part of the question: for whom has this worked and for whom has this not worked? There are still significant inequalities in terms of the quality of connectivity based on where people live in the UK. Infrastructure, broadband was mentioned, but also 5G, there's huge inequalities in that. Also based on socioeconomic deprivation, it's strongly linked to people's household incomes and wealth. For example, 31% of people, research by Ofcom shows, who are in the lower income brackets, household income brackets, have only access to a smartphone. So they have access, but with that, it's not sufficient to participate fully to get the kind of to get into education or work, or to facilitate the types of active participation that create content that is visible for people's stories to be heard, for people's life experience to be shared. So we get people using, but in a very passive way, and the online world is less and less representing who they are because of that. We also know, and this is related obviously, that serious issues remain in terms of skills. Even at the level of basic skills, and this is strongly related to education, formal education levels, but also in terms of what we might call more critical skills, in terms of the knowledge and understanding of how technology works and what impact they might have, when to use them and when not to use them, when it might actually be better not to disengage. In terms of how to evaluate information, misinformation was mentioned by Baroness, and to find quality services. So even the people who are online, especially are the people who have fewer educational resources or study in terms of literacy, traditional literacy, have a hard time once they're online actually getting the same quality out of the internet and other digital technologies. So while we are quite good in courses still, and this is an achievement at teaching kind of technical and operational and functional skills, how to use technologies, there is still a way to go to actually incorporate this more critical understanding, especially with AI that's coming up, because it's going to be less about how to use the technology and more to understand why the technology is giving you a certain recommendation to buy something, to go a different route, to use a certain service. We do not have enough knowledge, and I'm talking as an academic now, about really the inequalities in this area. Who's more subject to risks of misinformation, or who is more kind of at risk? And I think it's important here that what we do know is that the networks of support that Lizzie mentioned are extremely important. This is not an individual course-based thing or skills-based things. It's about the norms and the values and behaviors that we are observing in the people around us and how they engage, how they talk about technologies, how they engage with technologies in social and professional circles. And we still don't really understand enough about that kind of more like collective dynamic. The other area that I'm interested in, it was also mentioned this morning already, is another area where we don't have enough understanding is around the kind of inequalities in terms of psychological or socially kind of isolated, psychologically vulnerable or socially isolated people, and whether they might be more likely, there's some evidence to fall into these dependency cycles, to have negative engagement with technologies, which exposes them to bullying, harassment, and addiction. And there's a lot of noise in the media about this, but little nuance, I would say. And also, to a certain extent in policy. And while online safety acts are very important, it is also really important when we talk about inclusion to think about inequalities in this and who is more at risk and how can we design technologies so that especially, and it's not just children, this is across generation, this is about adults and the elderly as well who are more vulnerable. So that would be my contribution to this. I think we can swiftly move on to the next question, which is whether the panelists believe if we can eradicate digital exclusion in the next 10 years, let's be ambitious, in order to not exacerbate digital exclusion or to fix it, what needs to be done and by whom? And in this round, I would really like to start with Lizzie, if you would like to give your answer to that question.
Thank you very much indeed. To answer this question, I'd like to pick up on a point that Ellen's made, which is, what do we mean by access? Having an access point through a mobile phone, I think we all know that in this room, doesn't give you the kind of access that is needed necessarily for the services that we need to engage with. Helen talked about health, talked about education. This is if we want to develop enriched and empowered lives, then we need to think about access more broadly. Also, as has come up, I think from all the panelists here, what's also really important is that we understand that this isn't a linear process. We're not on a journey to independent access. People, skills are needed at different times, capabilities, support is needed at different times in your life. And we need to we need to acknowledge that. So I think eradication is an important goal, but I think it's an ambitious goal unless we maybe break apart and decide what we mean by digital inclusion. I think fundamentally, one of the really important points is that if we want to achieve this, we have to have the really difficult conversations about responsibility. Who is responsible for inclusion? Helen raised these most amazing partners, stakeholders that are working, but who is it? Who are responsible? This is multiple responsibilities. What roles do people play? So often in my area, in security and privacy, we see responsibilization happening. What happens is that responsibility for safer digital access is pushed to the farthest point, which is the person with the access. And all the responsibilities for that safety sit pushed out to that end point, we would think about it in technical design, an endpoint that has no possibility of taking on those responsibilities, even if we thought it was fair for them to do so, and actually acting on those responsibilities. So I think we need to have a much tougher conversation about responsibilities, and we need to think about how those responsibilities are distributed and how we make sure that those responsibilities are followed through. Because without that, we really are going to go round and round in circles. So I think that is fundamental. I think we also have a bit of a challenge often with how we think about technology. It's the magic something that's going to make something work. It's the magic ingredient. So if we have a conflict or a disagreement around maybe a health policy, maybe an education policy, often we offload the fixing of that onto the technology, if we can just make it accessible. A really good example here is I've been working on digital technology to help with rehabilitation in the home. And I think about it in digital access control. I think about it in terms of digital inclusion. And then I'm brought up short. And I should know this, that actually, if you can't do the rehabilitation exercise in the first place because you haven't got the support, you haven't got the space, you haven't got the confidence, no amount of having an app is going to help you get to that point. So I think we need to be really clear what the digital is doing and where the policy sits, and have some really honest conversations about that. From a security point of view, my plea would be, can we stop using access control and authentication technologies as a forcing function when we don't have that agreement. And I think about this time and time again in welfare policies, in digital identity policies, that we have to get agreement, because what happens is that security controls become the way that we try and make it happen. And I can tell you as a security person, that isn't going to work, because people have to buy into those controls if they're going to use them in the way that we intended them to be used. We have to have a way to bring the majority with us. And so it's really important that we get those really sticky conversations, we get those worked out and worked through.
Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yep. And the final thing I think to make this work is that we need to do more work in understanding the difference between people who are desperate to get access to a service and fraudsters and scammers. There was a terrific question in the last round about getting digital identity verified when you don't have all those documents. Time and time again, when we come across inclusive practices such as vouching, we hit a brick wall because the fraud argument comes in, and we need to do more work. Fraud and scams are really important that we deal with those, but we also need to find a way to manage that and manage inclusive access. And I think that needs more work. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Helen.
So do I believe we can eradicate digital inclusion in the next 10 years? I think from our understanding of digital exclusion today in 2024, I think the answer is yes. Obviously, in 10 years' time, our understanding of digital exclusion might be a little bit different. But I think that's one of the reasons why we absolutely need to focus on fixing that digital divide. I also think about, and what Lizzie and Ellen have said, absolutely, I agree with, that this is complex, and this is about deep inequalities, of which digital inequality is part of it. But the Labour Party came into power promising to fix the foundations, and those foundations include having access to the internet, being able to afford continued, sustained access to the internet. Can we fix that? Yes, we can, right? So I absolutely understand that the National Data Bank is a safety net. It's catching people who have already fallen, but it does give them free access to the internet. I have seen people weep with joy because we've given them a phone and free mobile connectivity for 12 to 24 months, 6 to 12 months, because of the impact on their life, because they can then get the support that they need, because they can then move on and some of the things that they're excluded from. But then on the other hand, the Nominet Digital Youth Index says that children should have access to a suitable internet connected device, which normally means something like a laptop that you can do your homework on, right? So I think we need to understand those nuances, but do not underestimate. We must not stop giving people free connectivity and free phones because they don't have anything, but we do need to make sure that we understand the journey that people go on. This is absolutely cross-sector. So whom? Let's focus on the government. So they've said that it's absolutely crucial. They've said it's top of their agenda. They've said it's part of fixing their foundation. So we absolutely, as Tim said, need a strategy, but also an action plan. We're calling for an action plan by Christmas. We all know that this isn't just about DCIT. This has to be cross-government. And that's difficult, even with a government who's come in with mission-led, with their mission for opportunities. They're still human beings with, thousands of people working for them, kind of steering them into their silo. But we absolutely need to make sure that we keep on talking to the government, that it's not just about DCIT. It has to be about DWP. Every single job centre needs to be identifying people who are digitally excluded from day one and helping them or signposting them. DFE absolutely needs to fix the curriculum, all age curriculum, to make sure that a proper digital skills fit for 2024, fit for the 2034 is absolutely embedded in the curriculum, obviously the health service, etc., etc. This is absolutely about joining the dots between digital exclusion, digital inclusion, and productivity and growth. I really want to make that point, that if we shift just 2% economic activity, so this is the long-term economically inactive, horrible term, but it's a reality. We're only at 78% economically active at the moment. If we shift that to 80%, that's 23 billion into our economy. Just imagine how different the budget would be in 2, 3, 4 years' time if we could fix that. And absolutely, those people are digitally excluded. Many of them are digitally excluded. We know 25% of people with a long-term health condition or disability are digitally excluded. We need that hyper-local work. So if we're going to create and drive, Rachel Reeves said last week, a new approach to public services through the use of technology. I believe in that. I believe that technology can drive better, more efficient, more convenient public services, but we have to have that national network for all. We need that network to catch people who can't use those services, be that temporary or for the long term. And obviously thinking about AI, we've started work with AI literacy, particularly working with Accenture. But so that very basics, people today in our communities are worried about AI, just making sure they understand what that means for them and how they can have that critical thinking to see how that works for them. But really importantly, and just coming back to what I said at the very beginning, that yes, of course, we need to fix access. Yes, of course, we need to fix skills, public services, making sure that people have that hyperlocal access. But we really do need to make sure that we understand that we're also building that confidence and agency that is really that the digital inclusion provides people with that equality to participate equally and safely in our society. And so I think we can. I think we all need to work together. And I'm really delighted that we have a government who's making the right words about their leadership on this subject for once.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So we agreed that I would be next. So I'll jump straight in. I think, I mean, this has been mentioned, and I won't kind of bang the same drum over and over again. But the question, do you believe we can eradicate digital exclusion in the next 10 years is, do we believe that we can eradicate exclusion in the next 10 years? And if we would put the question like that, I think people would say like, well, that's a bit of a ambitious goal to set. But I think it's important to reiterate that because we are not going to tackle inequalities in access, in skills related to the digital if we don't tackle inequalities and exclusion in terms of access to education, access to health, access to meaningful quality employment, and you know, if there's discrimination and harassment, if there's public figures who are using that kind of language and exposing that kind of behavior, this is going to be reflected in our digital world as well. I think it's also important to reiterate this point because I think one of the important things is if we're going to do this, and we were talking about who is responsible, I think we also need to think, what are we responsible for when we talk about digital inclusion? And we've all mentioned the importance of, you know, the outcomes and the impact on people's lives and well-being. So the accountability, if we have policies or interventions, should not be how many phones have we handed out or how many, you know, how many people have we exposed to courses, but have their lives actually improved? Are we doing it in a way that actually makes people feel confident, safe, with kind of power to change their lives for the better? And there is some evidence that the way in which we're doing it, and that's why we have to be careful, is that actually kind of while people are more online, they are also, especially people who have lots of struggles in their lives, using the internet in a narrower way, having, you know, kind of already mentioned the thing about mobile phones, access to fewer devices, are getting taught different kinds of skills than others. So we really need to look at that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, we really need to understand the local context, as was already mentioned by Helen. This means meaningful consultancy around design, mentioned by Lizzie, around what is it actually that people want to and need to get out, not from a top to bottom, if you want to call it that, but really listen to people in terms of what they need. And that this is not going to be, it's not just a one-size-fits-all, that doesn't work, but it's also not a one-off, right? This is going to be a lifetime learning and support issue in where people are and when they need it, and in a collective way. I think one of the important things that we've been working with, that actually, especially with smart technology, smart cities, AI, is that the responsibility needs to shift a little bit, because we've been talking about, oh, people are being left behind and we need to upskill, but it's the people who are designing technologies, the people who are using technologies, especially technologies that learn from the behavior and the output of people that are online, that are shaping this future world in their image, right? So people are entering into a world where answers are given based on the experiences and needs of people who are not like them. So I think from the beginning, in terms of the design and in terms of skills and awareness creation, actually the emphasis needs to shift a little bit more on the people who are in an advantaged position, who are creating these digital technologies. And that is programmers, policymakers, but it's also ordinary users. And we can start that from a very young age. How do you think liking a certain type of content impacts other people? How do you think the algorithm decides that this is what somebody likes you want to see? What about somebody who's like you? What do you think the digital world is like for somebody else? Because that will create a collective awareness and leading to collective action. So I think this is kind of, for me, very important, that we don't just focus on people who are already struggling to get by, but that it's really all of our collective responsibility, and that we're collectively also culpable of creating a digital world that might not be that welcoming or friendly. So access infrastructure is still fundamentally important, but it's not sufficient to make it sustainable. And I think that involves all of us. It involves especially community organizations, and I will kind of really congratulate Helen on the work that they have been doing, but also many other organizations in the UK on going to where the people are, doing the things that they want to do that are a benefit for them, and integrating the digital into that, just like the digital needs to be integrated across all the government departments. So the multi-stakeholder thing is a very important point for me as well. And I will leave it at that, and I will give the last word to Tim.
Thanks very much, Helen. I mean, it's pretty awe-inspiring listening to the solutions that other members of the panel are proposing. What I'd like to do is provide a bit of an envelope for that, because, you know, as you know, politicians can kind of make decisions, but actual delivery it needs to be willed in other ways. And I think what we have to be, if we're going to eliminate digital exclusion in the next 10 years, which is a huge, I mean, let's face it, when you look back over the last 10 years, we've seen all kinds of issues emerge. So the unintended consequences are the thing that bedevils government in that respect. So I think what we have to do is change our mindset. And I like to think of a broader digital citizenship. That there is an entitlement that drives a lot of the policies here. This isn't just something that we're doing because it does things to the economy. And, you know, Good Things Foundation and the Digital Poverty Alliance have done great work in terms of estimating just how much the economy could grow with proper digital inclusion. But I think this should be much more of a rights-based approach. And I would like to see actually a digital bill of rights that would give an entitlement. I'd like to see the universal service obligation improved enormously as part of that. So it is an ambitious, holistic approach, effectively, to the delivery of a digital inclusion plan. And what I'd like to see is a new government digital inclusion strategy. We need national level guidance. We need the resources and tools, many of which have been talked about today, that support local digital inclusion initiatives. But even if DCIT is in the saddle, and, you know, as Lizzie said, there needs to be much greater clarity around leadership, much more effective mechanisms for coordinating government departments' efforts. And, you know, Helen described graphically the kind of different government departments involved in all of this. And this is crucial. You have to have that leadership and that coordination. And then, of course, we've got the combined authorities, we've got county councils. All of them need to be brought into the strategy and the plans. And of course, at local level, and I'm now learning to call it hyper-local as a result of this panel, you know, we do have people like Good Things Foundation, Future.now, Digital Poverty Alliance, Virgin Money Foundation, CILIP, the Library and Information Association, in their different ways in this space. They need our and the government's support and resources to carry on the work that they do. And there are many other specific policies an agreed definition of data poverty, an assumed right to data. That's part of, if you like, digital citizenship, a digital right of way to public services. All of these were suggested by the all-party group in their 2023 report. Social tariff and data voucher auto-enrollment, because the level of take-up is so low at the moment. Making early termination of contracts free and simple. Creating a social inclusion fund, which I think is very much what the Good Things Foundation have been arguing for. And, you know, action on mid-contract price rises. All of these kind of quite granular aspects need to be dealt with. We need to bring Ofcom into the equation with their new media literacy duties under the Online Safety Act. And I very much liked Ellen's point about measurement of outcomes too. Politicians have this dreadful habit of having strategies without any measurement of the actual outcomes or a time frame within which those outcomes need to be delivered. But finally, and I think it's quite important in a digital gathering like this to make sure that the government always currently provides an analog alternative when it delivers services. What worries me, especially as we're moving towards one login for government ID, and we're moving towards private sector digital verification, digital identity systems to a much greater extent, is that there won't be that analog alternative for many, many people, and that will exclude them from services. So I think that's something we really do need to bear in mind, however good we get our digital access and inclusion policies, at least until we're sure that almost everybody has that kind of access and those kinds of digital services.
Thank you. From the analog to the digital, back to the analog. Full circle. Okay, I will open the floor to questions. So I don't know if maybe I will take 3 and then we answer and then another 3. Oh, there's lots of questions. We have 10 minutes. I'll see what we can get through. I'll take one from each side of the room. One where you're in the front and I think in the back. Yeah. Okay, if you want to start, sorry. I think you need to turn the microphone on the West. Yeah.
It's working?
Yeah.
Hi, Kat Dixon from Jangala. Thank you for a really fascinating panel discussion. I was really struck by, Helen, what you said about the NHS and it being a 2-tiered system amongst digital inclusion. I've just been doing research with people in temporary accommodation who have to bid for their housing for getting a permanent home once a week online. But there's no mandate to provide internet in temporary housing, and a lot of them don't have access to the internet, so they slide down the social housing list because they're digitally excluded. And I was thinking about what you said about mobile phone usage and about methods of authentication and digital IDs, and how it feels like with digital exclusion, I mean, catch-22s for people facing social disadvantage are not a new concept, but digital exclusion seems to be widening these. And it feels like we're reneging on some of our existing social contracts, like a free NHS, like the ability to apply for benefits. I guess my question is focused on regulation. Like, is there a role for regulation of public services or tech companies in this space? And should that be increased? Yes, you know, accessibility inclusion is definitely a rising awareness of this, and there's lots of campaigning, lots of civic society. But should there be a harsher standard if we are failing on our existing social contracts?
Thank you. This question, and I'll take it.
Louise Bennett, Director, Digital Policy Alliance. I've got a practical answer to one way we could do things. I've been thinking, where do I sit for large periods of time and I could be helped digitally? And the answer is in my doctor's waiting room, in the healthcare centre waiting room, in the hospital waiting room. And every one of those organisations has a different way of you accessing your interaction with those professionals. If you put people in those waiting spaces and said either before or after your consultation or your meeting, we will show you how to access us digitally, it will be an enormous help because I'm fairly digital savvy, but I lose patience with how I'm meant to interact with each different part of this. And that is not going to change in 10 years. It hasn't changed in the last 10 years. And I don't believe there'll be a common digital infrastructure. It's just a thought.
We'll comment on the thought. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I work at the University of Roehampton, and all people of all background can join, and that means a lot of firefighting that I do to help them. I've also lived in Nepal and in Wales, where the deprivation, and that has caused a lot of digital gap, and also in Uganda, where I work through the charity. And one of the things that I come across is education and deprivation that does bring a lot of misery locally. And so, as Helen said, and the hyperlocal, and also integrated, because if one has to go to library, church, community center to get all different things out in all different places, that's going to be more problems. I believe the internet and all of the supports from councils could be integrated and local or hyper-local. That's, I thought. Regarding the internet, now we're talking about the contract ending, and it may be an offense to a Western liberal economy, but why does government not have internet service as a company, as a provider? Why can't they be in the market competition? Thank you.
A public service internet, I think. Why do we not have that? So we have 3 questions. I will leave it up. We'll answer those. Who wants to go first?
Do I go first?
Yeah, if you turn on your microphone, then everybody can hear.
I'm the most foolhardy, so I'll tackle the first question. I mean, the widening gaps, I absolutely agree, and the dangers of that are really why I suggested a form of digital citizenship. Now, you could argue that that is regulation, and I do believe, and I don't want to anticipate the next panel, which is about AI regulation, but I do think we need proper regulation there in terms of transparency, accountability, freedom from bias, and so on. But I think this is a broader issue that there needs to be a duty. And you can see what happens when you impose a duty. The Data Protection Act way back, and I think the first act was in 1984 and then 1998, and then, of course, GDPR and so on. I mean, they've had a dramatic impact on how people deal with data. And I see no reason why digital citizenship, a digital Bill of Rights, shouldn't have that kind of impact on people's ability to access. And I think that, again, if you have duties like that, it makes people like the front desk of a GP and so on think about the interoperability of what they're doing. So, you know, if you have some kind of legal duty, maybe because I'm a legislator, I'm an optimist about regulation. I know a lot of people are very, you know, dubious about it. They think it's, you know, anti-innovation or whatever. But I'm a great believer in being absolutely clear that innovation has to be for public benefit and for our benefit. And that's what regulation is about. But I would like to see interoperability of standards develop explicitly as a result of that kind of entitlement to access through a Bill of Rights and digital citizenship and so on. And as far as internet
Tim, can I, because I've been told that we're running out of time, so I want to get the other panelists some time. Yeah, okay. Helen, you jump in.
I really like, Tim, your digital right of way for public services. I think that would be wonderful. And something that I've thought about a lot is there a guaranteed percentage of spend? You know, so if the government is spending X number of billions on digital infrastructure and digital services, that there needs to be 5%, 1% spent on digital inclusion. Obviously, with commercial companies, often we talk about levies, but I actually think this would be an area where a levy, so anyone selling things and their turnover being more than X millions of profit, then they could pay a levy. But just coming to Louise, that obviously we work a lot with hospitals, GP practices, maternity nurses, as I said. I think the question often is who pays. So they're doing that themselves because they see that there's a benefit, because actually their patients can't access the services that they need if they don't actually use their own staff to do it. But there's also this kind of very weird loop where we get money from businesses that we put into grants that then goes to a hospital to pay for the health inequalities lead to then do digital inclusion. Doesn't quite feel like but quite right. But it goes back to the last question about, well, more your comment about integrated at hyperlocal level. And I think that kind of comes back to the public right of way to the citizens' right of way to public services, because actually if you had a national network for all, that would deal with Tim's point about analog that I think we might have a little bit of a debate about, but actually it would provide a place where people could go to access digital public services in an integrated way at the hyperlocal level, but it wouldn't mean that every single service needs to keep an analog pathway.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think I'm going to give you the last word. I'm afraid we don't have more time for questions, right? So if you would like to make a final comment, and then we're going to go.
Thank you. So I think my take on these three questions fundamentally comes down to who pays and where does the money come from for the delivery of services. And the reality is that this is government, but it's also private sector. And that needs some very difficult conversations, but important and worthwhile conversations about how we bake inclusion into not only the technology, but also into the economic model. And that also means valuing activities that we possibly don't see in commercial terms as well. This goes to Louise's point, that it's about valuing those advocates, valuing those pathfinders, and how is that represented in this new economic model? And from there, regulation works together and we start to have a much more inclusive outlook.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. There were a lot of questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions online as well. So I do encourage you, I think all of us would be very open to receiving questions about this and to put pressure on the relevant stakeholders. But I wanted to thank you all for listening so attentively and asking the wonderful questions that we heard, and for the panelists for participating.
Yes, thank you so much to the panel. I'm sure everyone will agree that was a really fascinating discussion. We're just going to take a short break from 11 till 11:20. There's coffees and treats outside. So yeah, please feel free to help yourselves and meet us back here in 20 minutes. Thank you.
There we go. Welcome back, everyone, for our next panel discussion, which is about how can we achieve effective multi-stakeholder cooperation on digital governance. Our panel chair will be Chris Mundini, who is Managing Director for Europe at ICANN. We also have Arik Chowdhury, Head of Digital Policy at the Royal Society. We have Leah Kasper, Executive Director at Global Digital Partners. And we also have Ihsan Khan, Board Member for the Internet Society Youth Standing Group.
Mandini. As you can see, I'm the Managing Director for ICANN based in Brussels. I have an excellent panel of very experienced and insightful panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly in just a moment. I wanted to set the scene a little bit for the panel. Multi-stakeholderism is the theme of this Internet Governance Forum, the UK Internet Governance Forum. And we know very well that it was organized by a multi-stakeholder committee. And it's very well organized and very well done. And I want to make my compliments to everyone that's associated with it in terms of the venue, the logistics, the technology, and so forth. In the broader world, it's really a transformative time for the subject of multi-stakeholderism when you think of the various UN processes that are underway. You think about the IGF being in the spotlight, and you think about the many different forms and reasons for which we can apply multi-stakeholder governance. I work for ICANN, which is a multi-stakeholder model, managing a rather defined set of resources for the world, and even that can be arduous and complex. And now there are so many digital issues that we want to address at a societal or a global level. It's really a good time to learn more about what are the good practices, what's a good definition, and what can we learn from the various examples. And we'll be asking you to chime in with your questions, examples, observations toward the end of the panel. But without any further delay, I'd like to get to our panelists. So I will please ask Arik to start with a quick introduction of yourself. And the question is maybe a quick summary in your view of what do you believe effective means in the context of our panel title, Effective Multi-Stakeholder Cooperation?
Yes, so my name is Arik Chowdhury. Hello. Yes, my name is Arik Chowdhury. I'm head of policy for data and digital technologies at the Royal Society. If you're not aware, the Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Science. We're also a fellowship of the world's leading scientists, and we have a mission to promote science for the benefit of humanity. So my focus there is to think about how we can promote the use of data and digital technologies to alleviate societal challenges. Prior to this, I spent several years working in the broad space of tech policy. I ran my own small think tank for 6.5 years called Web Roots Democracy. I also worked in government. I used to also be very briefly worked in audit. So I used to take ICAEW exams for the building we're in. So it's very interesting. Anyway, on the question of what effective means in this context, so we think about this at the Royal Society from the perspective of understanding the views of our diverse scientific community, of which there are vastly different opinions, lots of different incentives at play. And effective, I would say, involves understanding what the consensus is amongst the community, and then also understanding where the divisions of opinion are. Because I think a lot of what multi-stakeholder governance is about having a discussion forum. It's about understanding, where the community might be at, even if you don't come to a decision. It's about highlighting some of those differences and areas of agreement.
That's great. All right, so we'll turn to Leah. And tell us about yourself, please, and define effective for us.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here today at the UK IGF. I'm the Executive Director of Global Partners Digital. We're a human rights UK-based organization that's been in this kind of internet policy space for nearly 2 decades now. you have more information about me in the on the website, I think. But I want to kind of turn to Chris's question immediately, and to start with, I wanted to do a little exercise and ask us to replace the word in this sentence, multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder cooperation, with something else. So what if we replace that with, say, democracy? Okay, and we ask a question of what is effective democracy? It is a hard question to answer. And the reason why this is a complicated question to answer is because democracy is not just one thing. And advancing it or making it effective is not just one thing, right? It includes having an independent media, having free and fair elections, having an educated populace. So if we go back now then to thinking about multi-stakeholderism in a similar way, because in a sense, they're both governance concepts, but in this case, we are talking about a governance concept that is specific and captures properties that are characteristic for the use, development, and governance of digital technologies, okay? So if you think about what that really is and the different scenarios that kind of are captured by the use, development, and governance of digital tech, you can immediately think of, from management of or laying of undersea cables, so infrastructure. You can think about developing a protocol, or you can think about the management of content on a social media website. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that depending on where you are and what actual problem you're trying to solve, you will need to be very thoughtful about the ways in which what Chris was talking about, which is the open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based principles or characteristics of multi-stakeholderism, how you apply them to that specific context. And if I may just end on this kind of introductory point by saying that we have been talking about this for at least since I've entered the field. So since WSIS definitely, but I remember in 2012 when I first started thinking about internet governance, and it almost feels like we haven't moved on this question. So I think the question that we can try to answer here and together with you all is how we get from that level of principles, the 40,000 feet definitions and principles that we have, to something that is more practical and yet isn't prescriptive in the sense that you define a model for each of those scenarios that I just mentioned, because that's not feasible either. And I'll offer kind of my answer to that question, but I'll end there for this round.
Oh, we have a cliffhanger. That's great. Thanks. So, Arik, you've talked about defining things like consensus and the utility even of identifying divisions. And Leah, thank you for your comments, because I think this question about what is the issue we are trying to govern together lends itself to thinking thoughtfully about the different techniques and processes. I'm going to turn to Ihsan. Please tell us about you and your view of what's effectiveness.
Sure. Thanks. My name's Ihsan Khan. I'm the board member of the Internet Society's Youth Standing Group, which is one of the numerous special interest groups for different sort of areas. We have one for online safety, for example, as well. We have one on gender. So there's one that's focused specifically on youth interests, and this topic in particular is quite important for the youth community, because the only reason the youth community is effectively able to sort of take part in these discussions is because of this sort of multi-stakeholder model that we have. This is not what I do by day. By day, I do data protection and cybersecurity, and like moonlight, I guess, as perhaps a diplomat on behalf of the youth, but the youth is not really a monolithic group. We are, quite sort of diverse as well. And there are many sort of stakeholders within that sort of youth community as well. We're having conversations earlier about, for example, because of the definition of the youth community being so broad, basically anyone under the age of 30, you have teens who have completely separate interests to people who are perhaps on the upper end of that scale. I know that a lot of people here effectively consider themselves to be part of the youth community, despite the fact that you've been here for way longer than I've been alive. But it's all about what's in the mind. But I think the way that I'd like to answer this question is perhaps by answering it in the negative, in the sense of what I think multi-stakeholder cooperation should not look like. Primarily because This is part of the lived experience that I have along with a lot of other members of the youth community, for example, taking part in the Global Digital Compact processes, which, a term was introduced to me by you, Chris, which is multi-stakeholder washing effectively, because, there were a lot of worries of the governance of the internet and other digital technologies moving towards a slightly more multilateral rather than multi-stakeholder setup, where it prioritized the interests of governmental sort of stakeholders over and above others. And I think the Global Digital Compact process was a sort of example of that, where multilateral processes tended to perhaps potentially co-opt, although that's not necessarily the right word, multi-stakeholder involvement. We were able to take part and participate in these sort of processes through, for example, consultation responses, very long, lengthy documents. We were able to, have like a 3-minute sort of speaking slot where we said what we had to say, and then we sort of moved on through, very long list of individuals who also had something completely different to say, but there was no real dialogue. There's no sort of, it was very transactional. And I think that is one of the issues that we've seen where, you try to orchestrate these sorts of mechanisms to get multi-stakeholder participation without actually, and I think this is the crucial thing, like there are many different characteristics of what makes perhaps an effective multi-stakeholder process. But I think one of them is this direct translation between the input and the output of the stakeholders, which is something that is, for me at least, a sine qua non. Like you need to have that, without which I think no matter how good you're able to create a sort of system, it might not actually translate to being effective. It's just participatory. And I think I'd like to engage with the other stakeholders a little bit more on that in due course. But thank you.
Thank you. That's great. I have to say it is one of the amazing skills that many of my colleagues and community members have of being able to assimilate inputs and produce outputs in a way that demonstrate that all of the inputs have been taken into account, even though they don't necessarily always arrive at what the consensus conclusion is. And so I really like that and I like that you've given us a real world example, even though it's a negative example. It sounds like your view is that it was more performative or transactional than genuine in the context of the Global Digital Compact. Does anyone have other examples, or would anyone like to give an example of something that's worked well? Leah.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you for bringing up the GDC. The Global Digital Compact is an interesting, I think, use case that we can test. I do want to note, maybe before we kind of go into testing whether something is effective or not, I think there's a missing step between the kind of principle and the application and the measurements, if you want to be really kind of technical about it. Over the years, the work that we've been doing, especially around like 2015, 2016, I remember at GPD, we dug really deep into what a multi-stakeholder approach to cybersecurity national strategies would look like. So if you're developing a national cybersecurity strategy, what would it mean to make that process multi-stakeholder? And kind of to help us there, we took those characteristics, I think, like that, most of the different frameworks that you mentioned, that Chris mentioned as well. So open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based. And we tried to say, okay, what would that look like in the context of cybersecurity? And we then realized that, and there are some examples where we've tested that, but what we found that is, before you can even start answering that question and defining to what extent something should be open, inclusive, transparent, and consensus-based, there are a couple of pre-questions that you have to ask. And one of them is, who are the relevant stakeholders? Well, actually, we can start with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Then the next question is then, well, who are the stakeholders that need to be involved in solving that problem? And maybe it's, what type of expertise do you need to have in the room to achieve that outcome that we were talking about? So input, output. And then you also have to think about the constraints. Yes, so cybersecurity is an interesting example because it does have a lot of constraints, given that it's tightly linked to national security issues. Yeah. So it might be a different set of constraints that you might have in a cybersecurity context that you would not have in another context. But maybe, can I ask a question, and then like maybe we can think through an example together? So let's take the GDC and turn Izan's kind of postulated that wasn't an inclusive or multi-stakeholder process. And let's say, what would it look like if it were multi-stakeholder, okay? So if we take that framework that I just played around with, say like you want to kind of make sure that you assess, let's say you're sitting in the Secretary General's office, yeah, and you're setting out this process from the get-go. And you look at what you think like the ingredients are of multi-stakeholderism, open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based. But then you sit down with your team and you start thinking about, okay, how broad is the scope of this thing that I'm doing? So maybe, anyway, someone can, is it broad, narrow, how broad? It's broad, right? Really broad. It's really broad. National, regional, global, it's global, okay? That's another thing to think about. The type of expertise that is required is, again, broad, yeah? So, and the impact on stakeholders is going to be felt around the world. So these are all kind of considerations that when you start thinking about who the relevant stakeholders are. But then you take it next. So what are some of the constraints that you might have? Anyone, like any constraints that you have as a team setting up this process? Shout it out, just anything. Money, yes, what else? Inclusion, connectivity, what else? Time, exactly, time, you have a timeline, yeah? So you have 2 years, let's say they started thinking about it a couple of years ago, you know, you have a 2-year framework, you want to include as broad a range of stakeholders because you define that the scope is very broad and you need broad range of expertise, input, output. So you sit down and you're like, all right, okay. Oh, and one more constraint that's really important in this case, it is going to end with an intergovernmentally negotiated document. Yes? So you put all of that in a cauldron and you say like, all right, now let's come up with a kind of roadmap for it. So all of this to say is that it's not a simple kind of like, you know, like magic wand. I think it's helpful to have a framework, and maybe we can, like, if people are interested, we can take that to the next level and actually design the process when we get to practical things that you can do to make it more inclusive, more open, more inclusive. But I just want to point out that kind of those broad considerations need to be something that are put front and center of considering what a multi-stakeholder, effective multi-stakeholder cooperation might look like.
Oh, I wish you were sitting in the Secretary General's office a few months ago. It's really a wonderful vision of a thoughtful, albeit arduous approach. But I think it's inspiring, and I think it's something that we can talk about why there's not more of that. I'm curious, Arik, from your experience at Royal Society, is there good examples that you can talk about, and what made them good for you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples out there. I think like Leah was saying, it really depends on how broad or narrow the area of focus is. So one area that we look at a lot in the Royal Society is open science. So we recently completed a project called Science in the Age of AI, which is looking at how AI is changing the nature and methods of scientific research. And one aspect of that piece of work was looking at how scientists can get involved in sort of governance questions and questions around data ethics and questions around AI safety when producing their own tools that they use in research or tools that get deployed elsewhere in society. And the sort of open science principles offer a framework in which to do that. They offer, guidance over like what should be made open in terms of data or protocols or code or research, or we spoke about in our report around there needing to be work around publishing failed results more. So we're having lots of LLMs trained on like successful academic research, but not enough perhaps on some of the failed areas. But and those are very narrow processes where lots of people can comment or make tweaks or highlight challenges, or people can come to consensus if they're working on individual projects. I think beyond that, we tried to do a lot of work on influencing government and other international policy. But taking the UK government as one example of focus, it can be very difficult to influence the UK government or try to build sort of multi-stakeholder approaches to influencing specific bills. Many people in this room would have been involved in the online safety bill, which again was in some ways a good example of multi-stakeholder cooperation, where you had a lot of people involved. But even then, it was still quite difficult, and not everyone is going to win from those processes. I think another challenge is also just understanding how to get involved and standardizing some of these processes. So there are lots of people at organizations who are coming up with their own ways of solving governance challenges. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is focusing on AI safety again. We've looked at red teaming as a way to sort of highlighting and mitigating some of the harms around disinformation on large language models, particularly around scientific disinformation. We did an initiative ahead of the AI Safety Summit last year where we got climate and infectious disease experts to try and break the guardrails of Meta's Llama 2 and sort of highlight the benefits of getting scientists involved in that process because they understand the specifics of it. And there are lots of organizations trying to do this and companies are trying to do this themselves, but there is no standardized approach for how to do good red teaming. Another example is you can also take a technical approach to achieving this. So one other area we look at is data governance broadly, because there's lots of useful data held out there, one in the public sector, but also in private companies. And there's lots of reasons to not share that data with others. But there are tools and techniques which could allow people to gain insights from data without accessing it. So we've done a lot of work on privacy enhancing technologies. And again, there's much more work to be done on standardizing these processes, understanding what works, what doesn't work, thinking about ethical approaches. So I think there are good narrow examples out there, depending on the goal you're trying to achieve and the type of governance you're trying to achieve. And I think that the Global Digital Compact, which we also try to get involved in, was, like you said, naturally probably the hardest example of this that exists out there, because, like you said, it's global and it's primarily still agreed by governments, even though it is theoretically involving anyone who wants to contribute to it.
That's great. So we've talked a lot about sort of frameworks and conceiving how to start with who's the proper, the questions that Leah posed. And I really like that you gave us a number of examples, Arik, where that were quite different actually, and which would have needed a sort of a more rigorous questioning at the beginning, as I think Leah is advocating, before thinking of what would be most effective. I want to talk about tools, techniques, processes, but did you want to, Ihsan, talk about a good example, an effective example?
Sure. I think one of the natural consequences of working on something so broad is the fact that there isn't exactly a solution that works for every single situation, especially when it comes to digital governance based on what you're trying to achieve. I think a good example, funnily enough, also exists within the context of the GDC, which is what the Internet Society's Youth Standing Group did, and in partnership with the Youth Coalition on Internet Governance, which is one of the dynamic coalitions of the IGF. And it mirrored, I think, in principle at least, or in spirit, what actually happened during Net Mondial and Net Mondial Plus 10, which is that it was like very, very chaotic, but in a very good way. It was all about trying to achieve consensus, very rough consensus on certain key areas that the Global Digital Compact was sort of focusing on, and really to sort of get down to the core of what the youth actually believed in and sort of getting rid of everything else that was sort of bells and whistles on the side, or maybe perhaps an irrelevant tangent, or perhaps something that was like a very, very niche interest that one of the members might have brought out, but that other people may not necessarily agree, fit in the scope of what was trying to be discussed. And I think those are good examples because we are able to solicit opinions from a lot of different people from different stakeholder groups. We're able to get their voices heard, and we're able to also make sure it's like basically a very large document with 100 people editing it. And everyone can see everyone's edits, and then people can sort of look at that and go like, I agree with this, I want to vote for this, I want to include this in the context of this document, and so on. And so I think, it was one example of, I think, a method that might not work in every single situation. I mean, if you're trying to come up with a sort of position paper in terms of what everyone agrees should happen versus you're, working on something that's like policy or something like legislation, which is very technical, the multi-stakeholder requirements will be different for each of them, right? And so I kind of agree with what Leah said, which is that, we have to be a little bit nuanced talking about the GDC process and the constraints that the UN Secretary General, or at least the Envoy on Technology, had. I kind of disagree with the fact that it had to be intergovernmentally negotiated as a document, because if we see what happened with Net Mundial Plus 10 and the Sao Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines, we can see that, you know, it is possible to develop a consensus document without it needing intergovernmental negotiation per se. I think the thing that the Net Mundial Plus 10 situation lacked was the participation of governmental stakeholders, which is where the UN Tech Envoy could have been involved. The whole job of the UN as an organization is to sort of act as this coordinating mechanism for governmental stakeholders. So if there's already a parallel process happening where you are able to come with this position paper, they're supposed to team up, and then you would be able to have a little bit more legitimacy to that process. Because again, one of the biggest criticisms of any single multi-stakeholder process that exists is the fact that there's one stakeholder group that's being overrepresented, right? For example, in the IGF, it's like, oh, we have too much civil society participation, but not enough governmental participation. Or, you know, for example, in IETF, we have too much private sector participation. So I think that, you know, it kind of, the whole point is to try to bring these stakeholders together. And that's, you know, where, you know, if we look at the WSIS definition, their respective roles and responsibilities, this is where the UN should have been involved, I think.
That's great. I'm delighted that you raised those examples. Leah, please chime in.
To finger on that, let's take another example then, and say we're dealing with an incident response. You know, so you're sitting in a national computer emergency response team, and I totally agree what you're saying, and I think in the not totally agree, qualify that. I think when it comes to the GDC, there could have been like different ways of approaching that process, but I do want to say that it can be misleading to give this idea that, you know, like all stakeholders should be consulted at all levels and to come up with every solution when it comes to digital governance. I'm not saying that you're saying that, but if you take a very narrow example of having 48 hours to deal with an incident where your cyber attack is taking place targeting national infrastructure, at that point, you can argue, so this falls under digital technology governance framework, according to Tunis, if you read it, so it applies, right? So it's an internet-related public policy issue that someone is dealing with. But who is involved in that process, right? It's not entirely open. It's not maximum consensus-based. At that point, you have 48 hours to deal with an incident. So again, I just want to say that really depends on kind of what problem you're solving for. I do want to give an example of I see Paul's just walked in the room. Very happy to see him here because I was going to give an example of what I think is effective multi-stakeholderism in practice that the UK government has been leading on and been championing for like over a decade now. And that is this, what we used to call it MAGIG, and it's now been renamed into a multi-stakeholder internet governance group that a number of us here have been a part of for a number of years. And it is a government-facilitated group that seeks to inform UK government policy and positions on a variety and engagements in a variety of internet governance settings. And it includes the IGF, which arguably anyone can attend, but it ranges all the way up to engaging in the ITU, which is an intergovernmental body. And I'm sitting here with where I can tell you that there is text right now in an ITU resolution that I have drafted because I was on that group and as a result participated in the UK delegation to an ITU plenipotentiary conference. So it is possible. There are constraints though when you sit as part of a government delegation in an intergovernmental process. But I would say that that's really, really, really good. And I want to say a noteworthy, laudable example of multi-stakeholderism at the national level.
Thank you for that. I was a little alarmed by the time, the emergency time constraint. I think it's raising the degree of difficulty in your emergency example. But the MAGIG, which now has a new name, which I was told. What's the new name? Oh, well, there you go. I think it has a lot to do with the experience of the governmental bodies involved in terms of seeing the results and seeing the benefits. And I think there's a long history of getting better answers and better results by consulting stakeholders and doing it, genuinely in a consensus-based way. I like also, Isan, that you used the word chaos in your response. I think there is something about these early stages of consulting with stakeholders. There's a certain facilitated chaos that helps to surface, as you said, ideas. And I, as somebody who was also involved in the original Net Mundial, I think others here were as well. It was well balanced among the stakeholder groups, and it was a little confusing and chaotic at times. And I was delighted to see that the Net Mundial plus 10 actually advanced and some of the questions and the principles we're discussing. Sort of practically speaking, in terms of like specific tools, technologies, methods in the actual stakeholder processes themselves, is there anything that you are using more? Has technology, innovation helped? Can we feed, the entire history of every transcript of ICANN into a AI model to just put it on autopilot? But any practical tips or tools that you've seen? Arik, how about at Royal Society?
Yeah, we're still quite analog, if I'm honest with you, at the Royal Society, and this is a limitation of our work. So again, our work at the Royal Society is quite narrow, but it's the science community is still very broad, and often we get, well, not often, occasionally we get people asking, how do I get invited to something, or how can we share our perspectives in some discussion? We had this ahead of the AI Safety Summit. We did a joint workshop with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology around horizon scanning, AI safety risks across scientific disciplines. And we decided to make this in person only, because sometimes to get the kinds of people you might want in the room, you have to make it in person. Otherwise, people just won't show up, because some people will want to meet other people. They don't just want to go simply to share their perspective on an issue. They want to go for the networking and the relationship building, etc. Obviously, like Leah was saying, you're limited therefore by your resource, and in our case, it's a room. So it is difficult to think about how to do this properly. I want to share a very different example, actually, if I can. So I used to work for a Labour member of Parliament called Graham Allen, and he's very interested in something called a citizens' convention or a constitutional convention, which is this idea that you could gather ordinary citizens over a prolonged period of time to come to a consensus on a controversial constitutional issue or a topic or any topic, actually. And when I worked for him, part of my role was to think about how we could do this digitally. And his vision was something like 10 million founding fathers and mothers of a new UK constitution, something like this. And in that research, it became very clear that these things don't work unless there is real buy-in from the outset from the decision makers who are going to implement whatever it is that you're looking at. So where they do have constitutional conventions and where they work successfully, say in Ireland, they have buy-in from the government who will say, we will, one, put money into this, which is important, because if you want people to really participate, sometimes you have to get them to come out of work. So, and if you want to be inclusive of like low income individuals, etc., you're going to need to pay them to participate. Another example is, they had like very nice invitation cards sent out, so that's taken seriously, that people don't throw it in the bin. Or in the US, where they have a mechanism for this. I can't remember exactly how it works, but you need a certain number of states have to vote in favor of having a constitutional convention, then you can change the constitution. So if we were to try something here in the UK without that buy-in, it just won't work, because people won't show up. There won't be the money behind it. There won't be guarantee that if you participate in this process, something will change as a result. So I think tools are useful, and V-Taiwan is a good example that's often cited. But you need to have buy-in, and people try to think about how we can replicate that here. But you need to have buy-in from decision makers for that to work. So I'd say there are lots of limitations there.
That's great. Those are great. That's very helpful. Anyone else want to comment on tools, approaches, processes, technologies that you've used or you've seen, that you've adopted?
I'll start. I don't think that's necessarily the most important thing. think we're kind of not there yet where we agreed on a framework. And before we do that, kind of the tools are secondary. But there have been things that from general participatory democracy that we can also kind of learn from other processes that are useful in our way of thinking of creating more consensus-based outcomes, if that is what we agree is part of multi-stakeholderism. And Net Mundial, the original one, actually, I was there in 2014, and that was a really interesting example of consensus-based outcome document where you had different stakeholders at the same level. There's a whole question of to what extent that is applicable to legacy processes that we already have in international relations. I think let's not be naive about where this applies and how. It's there are tensions between what we have right now in international relations and cooperation and what we're talking about here. So I kind of, if you don't mind me following up on that, just to say that, and it goes back to also my experience at MAGIG, now MIG UK, where originally, when I started looking at internet governance, you know, I have this kind of problem-oriented academic mind where, like, I need a framework, I'm going to measure, we're going to come up with everything, and then you present that, and it still doesn't happen. And I remember kind of making the point, this was sometime in 2013 maybe, it's like, oh, this is so great that the UK government is doing this for the ITU. Yes, let's now, next step, like GPD at the UN General Assembly on the UK delegation discussing cybersecurity. Did that happen? No, it didn't. And I couldn't understand it at the time. For me, it was all part of the Tunis agenda definition of internet governance, cybersecurity, or you know, discussing something at the ITU. In my mind, it was all like, yeah, why not? The issue I think that I've learned is that the problem that we're talking about here is not academic or practical, but it is political. And the issue that we're dealing with kind of goes into the fact that the multi-stakeholder cooperative model that we're talking about, I don't know if you want to call it model or approach, doesn't really matter, but the idea has evolved from the necessity of techies, really kind of solutions-oriented technologists who just had to deal and manage the root, right, and DNS, and like that's where it came from. And they were dealing with technical problems that can be, I'm simplifying here, can be measured in ones and zeros. But when you translate that to, and this is what we're talking about here, now the digital tech has become mainstream across the whole of society. What we're talking about is applying the same model, which is quite technocratic, to socio-economic political issues, right? With security, with the child online protection. That's not the same as resolving a technical problem. I mean, Chris said, you can, although obviously, and there's been arguments about like how these are now merged and technical and policy are basically one. I don't think it's the same. I think there is a difference between a technical issue and kind of a more policy, broader issues that we're dealing with when you kind of step outside that narrow technical definition of IG.
I think that's probably a good really transition to talking about the future and hopefulness. On the one hand, it's very inspiring that you see more attempts by more bodies and organizations to adopt, however ill-informed they may be, multi-stakeholder processes to address problems. But on the other hand, and particularly in the global digital governance sphere, you know, here we are as proponents of multi-stakeholder governance in a context of a geopolitical era, which is really much more competitive, confrontational, and almost centrifugal. And so in addition, for example, to ICANNs having a defined technical resource for governance, it also grew up in a time and this was established in a much more globalized context for the world. So I suppose my question for you is about the future. Are you hopeful that multi-stakeholder cooperation and governance will continue to have successes and or what's the big picture for the future of multi-stakeholder governance, and what advice would you have for its proponents?
I'm quite optimistic, so I think naturally we've all kind of touched upon some of the limitations of this, but no one really disagrees that this is a good thing to have. And I think what we've seen is it'd be shocking to see major pieces of governance or legislation or whatever it is done without first thinking about multi-stakeholder governance. And I think as sort of the internet space and AI, whatever it might be, kind of continues to mature, you're seeing a lot of people who are now experienced in doing this for decades, who will get good at doing it and better at doing it, and be able to take those lessons forward into doing it much better and more effective in future. And whether that's with new tools or with a proper understanding of how to get people involved, how to keep people included, I think that will only really get better. I think the key thing is making sure it doesn't really slow down, and making sure that it's not being done for the sake of it. Things I've been involved in. I can't think of specific examples now, but the ones where I feel frustrated is where it's a tick box exercise, and I'm sure many of us will have felt this, where you're asked to show up and share your opinion just so that someone else can say that they did multi-stakeholder governance, but really didn't pay attention to what was being said. So I'm quite optimistic. I think this is the norm now, but I think it's a question of how to perfect it.
That's great. I'm going to ask Ihsan, you're involved with youth. That's the future. What do you think's happening in the future?
I mean, we kind of have to be optimistic, not gonna lie. I mean, if we weren't, we wouldn't be doing stuff like this. And, the more authoritarian elements and angles would be able to dominate the discussion, right? And we present a very important force in resisting that and making sure that multi-stakeholderism continues to be the MO of at least internet governance, if not, other areas of international global cooperation. I want to touch upon sort of weave this discussion into the previous one based on what Leah was saying of how this is like a very, very political sort of problem, and the political situation, political buy-in is equally as important. And we have to consider sort of like legacy institutions and how we can sort of, work this in that context. I mean, I would tend to disagree a little bit over there because, well, two reasons. Number one, international law only exists in textbooks on international law. It's like a very famous aphorism because, again, like the whole Global Digital Compact process and the institutions or the high-level panels or advisory boards and all the other, devices, let's call it that, that the Secretary General put in place leading up to the GDC were all sort of like arbitrarily designed almost, like especially in terms of the composition of those high-level panels, including the high-level panel on AI, which was like out a couple years ago as well. Like we have the ability to design what future we want. Right. And I think that's something that gets lost a lot in like these very deeply technical discussions about, legislation and rules and procedure. And I think like, the youthful part of me, well, I mean, I am part of the youth, but like the youthful part of all of us, I feel, should like try to like have that naivety and that optimism, that blind desire to try to push for a better future and to rally around the organizations that we have the capability of influencing, right? So over here, we have, for example, an in towards governmental sort of organizations and individuals, for example, in the crowd, regulatory organizations, members of the private sector. We should expand our influence over here and try to say, this is the kind of future that we want. This is what we actually want to try out. And so in terms of designing, for example, different multi-stakeholder processes, we should experiment. We should, for example, create like almost a like regulatory sort of sandbox of sorts to try out different ways of getting people's input towards things that they would ultimately be affected by. And that's the reason why we have multi-stakeholder governance, right? It's like we have agency, we have the consent of the governed effectively. It's an extension, as like Leah said, drawing back to the discussion that was had in the very beginning, like just replace multi-stakeholder cooperation with democracy. That's basically what we're trying to do over here. So I am optimistic, and I do believe that there are better paths that we can all craft together. And that's the positive note that I want to leave everyone on. It's like we can imagine a better future. It's very schoolboyish, but I feel like the more people that have that attitude, the better. And we can easily get drawn down in all of these technical discussions that make us lose sight of that. So
So we have 2 votes for optimism, and we're about to go to questions. Leah, just on a final note, you optimistic about the future?
Pessimistic in the short term, optimistic in the long term. Like the GDC is one example, and I do want to say that now going into the WSIS plus 20 review, I know we have a panel coming up this afternoon talking about that. Haven't been there for the original WSIS, but having been there for the WSIS plus 10, already kind of looking at how the process, we have David Suter here in the audience. I know he's going to be hopefully telling us more about what that process is going to look like, but just comparing it to what we had even for the plus 10, from my perspective, we've seen a backtracking on some of the commitments to open up and implement some of these, I want to say, innovative approaches to governance, especially when it comes to the UN. So we were quite disheartened by the kind of the what the GDC looked like, and even the institutions that have kind of made inroads and improvements. UNESCO is one of them, for instance. They've done a great job in recommendations on the ethics of AI and other frameworks. But then when they come up with a different process, it's almost like they forget that they've already done kind of this multi-stakeholder cooperation. So I don't know. I think there's we need to be, I think, cognizant of like, yes, while we can kind of be hopeful and keep the principles in mind, there is a battle ahead. And I think I want us to be pragmatic about that.
Great, thanks for that very nuanced approach to the question. All right, so now it's your turn if you have questions or comments, and I'm sure we'll have some online. We have just a few minutes left. So I'm going to start over here at the far end, please.
Hello, Aranio Mary Iswa. There's a quote: "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." And that was a quote by Shirley Chisholm. She was the first Black woman to run for the US presidency in 1972. And she's the giant on whose shoulders Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris stand. My question is for Leah regarding the scenario you outlined about the frameworks, because in 2017, the Africa Internet Summit was held in Kenya. And at that time, Cameroon was experiencing an internet shutdown. And during one of the discussions, which got really heated, it was about, you know, what can be done. Now, fast forward to 2024, Kenya itself experienced an internet shutdown. The Kenyan IGF had to be pushed back because of that. And I remember at the time trying to bring the concept of internet shutdowns into one of these multilateral meetings, and I was effectively shut down. So when you decide on a framework, does it take into account the geopolitics of what's happening in the world? I consider myself to be a global citizen. I was born here. I've got a British passport, but my parents are from the border of Kenya and Uganda. So at that time, I don't think internet shutdowns were as high on the agenda as they are today, given everything that's going on. So I mean, I got the impression when I voiced what was happening, it was, okay, this framework is fixed. So my question to you is, shouldn't it be a bit more malleable? Or is it that because I was considered to be from the global majority, my input wasn't welcome? Suffice to say, I'm not only going to bring a folding chair, but I'm building my own table.
That's great. Leah, do you have a response? It seems to me you talked about starting out with the framework, and as I interpret the question, is the framework evolvable or malleable to make room for when we realize that not every participant is appropriately included?
I mean, absolutely. Of course it is. Actually, Kenya is a really interesting example. They actually have, they're one of the few countries that I am aware of, maybe the only, that has actually a provision for multi-stakeholder, for the multi-stakeholder approach in their constitution. So there's actually like a constitutional right to contribute to shaping policy in Kenya. So obviously then, like when it comes to, there's always you know, question of the gap between the principle and its implementation. And we often, like coming from a human rights organization, it's not that we don't have the rules, it's just that we have an international framework for human rights. We were talking about this before the panel started. It's just that sometimes it's not implemented. So I would say that it is our joint responsibility to make those, to make the operationalization of existing principles better, and at the same time kind of work to improve the frameworks themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more in the room and then go to online. Please, you, sir.
I joined ISOC nearly 30 years ago. I paid $25, and the expectation was that I was going to try to help bring in a user voice. Now, the user multi-stakeholders are conspicuous by their absence. We'll take consumers, Mumsnet, Parentkind, Youth Voice in the UK, their equivalents in most other countries. We'll take business from FSB up to HSBC. About a decade ago, a consortium of banks tried to join ICANN and IETF with big budgets to try to introduce due diligence into the domain name system. Took about 18 months, but they were seen off very firmly. This is not the business of the users. Go away. Governance is we lovely supplier-side community and our acolytes. Does governance include a user voice? If so, who's actually going to encourage and welcome users to get involved, bearing in mind that if they're totally ignored, they go off and they do things through the ITU with governments around the world that totally sod up your nice, cozy model, or risk doing so.
Thank you. I have an answer, but I'm just curious. Well, I would please, I encourage you to come back to ICANN. We're kicking off on Monday, November 11th. I know it's a holiday. People will be free. You can sit down with your cup of coffee and follow an ICANN public meeting. It's in Istanbul. So it'll be a nice early morning start for you. They're simultaneously interpreted, they're broadcast completely hybrid, participatory, ask your question, get involved. And you will see that we, at least at ICANN, have a very active and global at-large community, which is dedicated to the user's interest. And in fact, they're an advisory committee that really looks at every ICANN policy that's coming out and puts it through the filter of how will this affect the user. They add a lot of value to the process. And so I'd love to chat with you about how that's evolved. I'm just curious, please, Arik, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so most of my examples are quite narrow, but this is a really important question. One project we've been doing at the moment at the Society is it's called Disability Data and Assistive Technologies. So we're looking at the landscape of assistive tech for people with disabilities, thinking about how we can advance them and you know, look at market failures, think about low shot machine learning, etc. And you know, something which has come up a lot in this conversation is, you know, how do we get users involved? Who are those users? Where do you get them involved at what stage? And you know, in the disability space, you know, that there are no real representative you know, voices of people with disabilities, because each even category of disability is very different and people have different needs. So I think to answer this question on a much broader scale, so we're looking at a very narrow well, relatively narrow case, but looking at a much broader case would be so difficult, and I'd be very interested to know either from yourself or others, how the user voice could ever be really properly integrated into these sorts of global multi-stakeholder governance models.
Thank you for that. Let's go please to an online question.
Yeah, so we have a question from Siva Subramaniam M, and they say, if in the IGF, civil society, and in the IETF, the private sector, participate in higher numbers, is it possible that governments tend to gain more even with visibly fewer numbers? So I think the first bit is a statement of IGF, lots of civil society, IETF, lots of private sector, governments, not so many people, but do they tend to gain more even though there are less of them?
Yeah, I think this is a question about unfair advantage or, dominance, which as long as we've been in this field, I'm sure we can all talk about, perceptions of that. And do governments have an unfair example? I think we touched upon that a little bit in the panel discussion, but I'm just looking, Isan, please.
Sure. I think, so one of the reasons why governments don't necessarily, this is again, pure hypothesis. This is just the perception of, myself as well as others that I've spoken to in the context of the IGF, is number one, I mean, there's three reasons, right? Number one's capacity building, especially for, smaller states or states that don't necessarily have as much of an interest or say in, digital infrastructure related questions, maybe because they're already far ahead in their own journey, or perhaps they don't really know. So capacity building is another potential problem in the sort of public sector sort of space, especially if digital is not as high on their list. So that's one reason why we don't see governmental participation over there. But the second, and I think the most important reason, is basically the IGF acts as a forum for global policy discussion and the exchange of these ideas. And it's not the only forum that does that. There are plenty of other organizations that do that, that do involve governmental stakeholders and no one else. And I think it's all about the willingness of these governments to learn from other sort of stakeholders rather than purely from other governments. And again, this leads to a slightly more politically charged question of what do governments actually want to do with the internet? And the main thing that they really want to do, from what we've seen, at least in terms of this digital divide, not necessarily in terms of access to communication, but I'm talking about the digital political divide, is whether they want to adopt a slightly more free or open route towards the governance of the internet, or whether they want to have a more authoritarian version of the internet, in which case the IGF isn't actually going to help their purposes over there, because what they don't want is multi-stakeholderism, right? And so I think that ultimately governments do have the home field advantage in their own home nation, right? They are the ones that set the rules. And so if they don't intend to actually take part in global policy discussions, we won't see them. They already have the unfair home advantage. And so I think that's part of the reason why we don't really see as many governmental sort of stakeholders in these fora, and we should actually be encouraging them to not only attend these sort of conferences, but to attend them with a view to understand what other stakeholders are doing. So I'll stop over there because I see that.
That's great. That's really great observation. I would like to, I think we might have time for one more. Do we have any more online? I'm going to take another one online, please.
So we have Subhash from United Network who's asked, with the increasing sophistication of AI-powered cyber attacks, how can we ensure that our cybersecurity strategies and governance frameworks keep pace and globally coordinate for this?
Question. Yes. I'm going to, can I take this next question too? And then I'll let anybody answer either.
Thank you. My concern is about fragmentation. The lovely IETF have published all the standards as they should be standards, which means that a country or regime who wants to succeed from the internet can do so, as, say, North Korea already has done. What can we do about rooting around that? John Gilmore said in 1993, the internet interprets damage, interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. Can the rest of the world help root around internet fragmentation?
Okay, well, these are two big topics, and I'm curious if anybody has any pithy response. One's about global coordination in response to cyber attacks, and the other is about what's the best approach? How can we avoid or heal around or fragmentation? Go ahead, please.
So I don't have a good answer to this question. These are very big questions, but I want to highlight or echo the sentiment. So we've done some work a couple of years ago about disinformation and primarily focus on scientific disinformation and think about the Online Safety Bill Net Act. And one thing that came up in there was this question of censorship. Whether should we censor scientific misinformation was a big question, and we cautioned against that. One reason for it was exactly this problem of fragmentation, but rather than countries, fragmentation amongst across the internet. So you think about the Online Safety Bill, the Online Safety Act, so focus primarily on these big companies, and not really considering that information moves around the internet as it's censored or removed, etc. And now you have lots of different platforms who don't have a public affairs team in London or a contact or a name director, etc. So I think fragmentation is something that should always be considered in these conversations. Like it's not just the same 5 or 6 big tech companies who control the internet. There are lots of small players. So very much agree that fragmentation is something we should think about, not just on a global scale, but also amongst companies and providers as well.
Well, thank you very much. We've really reached the end of our panel. Frankly, I expected more WSIS plus 20 questions. I'm sure that will be coming up in the later session. If people are interested, on December 4th, our interim CEO, Sally Costerton, here in London will be convening stakeholders to discuss and consult with UK stakeholders about the WSIS plus 20 process. I'm really delighted for our panel. We discussed frameworks, we discussed principles, we discussed practical approaches, and on balance, we are slightly more optimistic than pessimistic. I invite you to give a round of applause to my colleagues here on the panel.
Yes, thank you very much for what I think everyone would agree was a fantastic panel. I now invite everybody to go for lunch. We will be back here at 1:20 for our next discussion on the governance and regulation of AI, but there is lunch in the atrium.